Chapter 1345. Meeting again. Klein turned around and looked at the familiar yet unfamiliar figure. He had imagined all kinds of attacks on Utopia, but he had never expected such a scene to occur. If Amon had parasitized the marionette, Gehrman Sparrow, then with Klein's current status and the spirit worms on Sapphira Castle, he definitely would have immediately discovered the problem. And if Zeratul were to swap the spirit body threads, he could only temporarily hide it from him. Furthermore, he needed help from an angel like a knowledge emperor or a servant of concealment to ensure the element of surprise in the sudden attack. Only the humanity provided by a spectator could slowly ferment, without revealing any abnormalities on the surface. To prevent such a situation, he could only sever the spirit body threads and allow the marionette to deteriorate till it died. That way, regardless of whether it had any humanity in it or not, it would ultimately cease to exist. Unfortunately, Klein had never heard of such methods before. All he did was guard against the invasion of a virtual persona on his marionettes. This might be the power of a visionary, giving life to everything virtual and immaterial, a unique sense of humanity. The carved and cold face was reflected in Klein's eyes as he felt a force pushing him away. He immediately fell backward, falling from the layers of ruins of the old metropolis out from the fog of history. During this process, he wanted to control himself, but there was nothing he could do. This was because the wooden stake at his heart had sealed all his beyonder powers. With a thought, Klein looked at Gehrman Sparrow and snapped his fingers. But the worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle received his will and gave up the marionette's spirit body threads. They also picked up the Staff of the Stars and prepared to give Klein a fatal blow so as to commit suicide. After his main body completely died, Klein would be able to revive above the gray fog and escape from his predicament. He no longer held any hope after finding out that Adam was the mastermind behind the scenes. At this moment, a stone square floating in the void appeared beneath Klein's feet. Black stone pillars rose up and propped up a grand and holy cathedral, enveloping Klein inside. The Corpse Cathedral, Adam's Corpse Cathedral, the divine kingdom of a visionary. Boom! Countless bolts of silver lightning smote down from Sapphira Castle, penetrating the fog of history and struck the cathedral, but failed to shake it at all. At the same time, in the ancient palace, the figure sitting in the fool's seat suddenly collapsed to the side, forming a vortex formed from transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery and strange tentacles, crazily smacking the surroundings, overturning the junk pile, and destroying the long mottled table. Klein's avatar had lost contact with his true body, and because his true body hadn't really died, they had lost control and went crazy, just like Zeratul from before. In the old metropolis before the first epic, Gehrman Sparrow, who was wearing a half-top hat and a black trench coat, looked up at Sapphira Castle, his expression mixed. He was basically a corpse. After his spirit body threads were abandoned, he naturally couldn't maintain his existence. The only thing Adam gave him was humanity. There was no envisioned life for him, as that would result in the discovery of there being something wrong with Gehrman Sparrow. Gehrman Sparrow slowly collapsed as he looked at the rooms in the old metropolis. He died in this ruin. Klein's feet landed on the ground and stood in the middle of the cathedral. He saw that every arch of each pillar was embedded with the skulls of different races. Most of them were pale white in color as they were packed densely together, staring at the intruder with their hollow eyes. On the walls, windows, and doors of the cathedral, transparent, distorted, and painful faces appeared, separating the interior from the outside world. And in front of the cathedral stood a cross that was more than 100 meters tall. In front of the cross were rows of black pews. Adam, who was wearing a simple white robe and had a pale gold beard, was standing under the cross with a silver cross hanging from his neck. He faced the pews like a priest who was preparing to deliver a sermon. His expression was warm and his eyes were limpid as though he was only inviting Klein to listen to the scriptures. Klein lowered his head and looked at the cross-shaped wooden stake that was stuck in his chest. He slowly walked to the first pew and sat in the middle. For a true mythical creature formed from many worms of spirit, the wound on its chest wasn't fatal. The main purpose of the ancient bloody cross stake was to seal his beyonder powers. If not for the true God standing in front of him, Klein could have used his physical strength to pull out the wooden stake and remove the seal. At this moment, he didn't make any attempts because he was afraid that he would turn the thought of not daring to not willing to. I didn't expect you to directly interfere in this matter. If you wanted to deal with me, you didn't have to wait until today. Klein looked at his blood-stained shirt and seriously voiced his doubts. He wasn't afraid at all, as if he was certain that Adam wouldn't kill him. Adam held the silver cross pendant with one hand and calmly said, "Before now, you were able to be of quite some use in many ways." He took 2 steps forward and continued with limpid eyes. "When Aman came to steal the corpse cathedral, I made a deal with him. By helping me obtain the first blasphemy slate, I'll help him capture you. Does that so?" Klein was instantly enlightened. On the one hand, Adam didn't wish to be obstructed by existences like the true creator when he became a god, and on the other hand, he wanted to obtain the first blasphemy slate. Therefore, he used the unshadowed crucifix and other methods to give Klein an impetus to head for the giant king's court, open the door to the chamber where Sasra was sleeping, and attract the attention of the true creator and other existences. On the other hand, he used his brother, Aman, to steal the first blasphemy slate at the critical moment. And to capture Klein, who was about to obtain preliminary control of Sapphira Castle, it would definitely be most appropriate to have a visionary arrange the developments for him. Although Aman and Adam usually appear distant, they are still brothers and can work together more easily. Klein nodded slightly and looked at the stained glass that had distorted faces. "I also didn't expect Zeratul to cooperate with you. Isn't he afraid of becoming food for Aman?" When Klein established Utopia, he had considered Aman's attack and Zeratul's destruction. However, he never expected that they would work together in a certain way. From his point of view, the chances of Zeratul completely siding with the Mother Tree of Desire were higher than this, unless Adam had unknowingly arranged such a development for him. Adam's limpid eyes showed sympathy. To him, you becoming a great old one means that he will definitely perish. However, if Aman becomes one, as long as he expresses his loyalty, he can still retain his present level and status. A Lord of the Mysteries still requires an attendant of mysteries. Therefore, he chose to cooperate with me. During this process, if he can seize the opportunity and turn you into a marionette before I do, using you to enter Sapphira Castle and become the owner of the Sapphira, then has the right to demand an opportunity to face Antigonus at Evernight's place and have an ultimate showdown with Aman. On the contrary, he will completely admit defeat and pledge allegiance to Aman. On this point, he was very decisive. "It doesn't seem like your style to explain so much," Klein replied casually before frowning. "You don't need all the sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of the corresponding pathway to become a great old one." He had deduced this from the relationship between the ancient sun god and the 8 kings of angels. However, he believed that one had to first become a great old one or a quasi-one before dividing the characteristics. Adam replied gently, "For neighboring pathways, all that's needed is a uniqueness and a sequence 1 beyonder characteristic. It's easy to lose control if one forcefully occupies more. Therefore, after Zeratul pledged allegiance to Aman, he still has the chance to become a king of angels. And he isn't able to pledge allegiance to you because he can't separate a sequence 2 avatar like those from the Marauder pathway, and then stealing his main body's spirit body, consciousness, and psyche over, turning the avatar into the main body. This was the qualitative difference between a seer's marionette and a marauder's worm of time. The former involved spirit body threads, while the latter relied on themselves. Furthermore, the reason the Marauder Angel could do this was because their sequence 2 was Trojan Horse of Destiny. Just as Klein nodded, he suddenly saw Adam turn his body, revealing something beneath the cross. It was a gray stone slab. There were many mottled marks on its surface, making it look rather ancient. This was very similar to the first blasphemy slate, but it didn't have that abnormally ancient feeling to it. It also had words that looked like the source of all languages. They were written with the names of sequences and potion formulas. The second blasphemy slate? Klein asked in surprise. His gaze quickly swept across the stone slab. He didn't read the first few paragraphs, but instead looked at the last few lines. His intuition told him that there was a very important piece of information there. There's no need to rush. Amon has to complete the ritual and become a sequence 0 before stealing your fate. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to withstand the identity as Sapphira Castle's owner. And before that, it's best to let you continue staying in my kingdom. Adam acted as though he was consoling a repentant. Klein muttered inwardly. At this moment, he figured out the last few lines. God Almighty, Creator, Maker, the Omnipotent and Omniscient, Lord of the Astral World. Sea of Chaos plus Visionary Uniqueness plus the Sun Uniqueness plus Tyrant Uniqueness plus White Tower Uniqueness plus the Hanged Man Uniqueness plus 1 Author Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 White Angel Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Thunder God Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Omniscient Eye Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Dark Angel Beyonder Characteristic. Lord of the Mysteries, King of Space-Time, Beacon of Destiny, Embodiment of Sapphira Castle, Dominator of the Spirit World. Sapphira Castle plus the Fool Uniqueness plus Error Uniqueness plus Door Uniqueness plus 1 Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Worm of Time Beyonder Characteristic plus 1 Key of Stars Beyonder Characteristic. Upon seeing this, Klein turned his head to look at Adam and asked in puzzlement, "Why are you showing me these? Wouldn't it be safer to hypnotize me and put me to sleep until Amon becomes a god?" Adam's eyes were clear as he said with a warm expression, "To be frank, if the other party wasn't Amon, then I'd be more willing to help you become the dominator of the spirit world. We have too many things in common. In a sense, we are old friends who have met before." With that said, he smiled and said, "We meet again, Mysteries." Chapter 1346, The Specialness of a Visionary Mysteries. The last time Klein heard this title was from the consciousness of the true creator that had descended. The penultimate instance was from the ancient sun god from history, the City of Silver's creator. In a sense, the two of them were equal. The true creator was equivalent to the ancient sun god, evil spirit, after retrieving Sasrur's personality. However, unlike before, Klein wasn't flustered when he heard this manner of addressing him. Neither his heart trembled nor his teeth chattered. At this moment, he felt as if he had finally seen a suspended rock fall to the ground. Of course, he wasn't that calm either. To a certain extent, surprise, shock, and disbelief were inevitable. It was because of the words, "Adam isn't necessarily Adam," from Arihog that he had already come up with many speculations and was mentally prepared. We meet again. Mysteries. Adam is equivalent to the ancient sun god? Or is this the resurrection contingency of the ancient sun god? He knows of this, but he still wishes to revive his father, so that's why Medici calls him a zealot? Thoughts flashed through Klein's mind as he gained a brand new understanding of certain matters. It was no wonder Adam never promoted teachings about himself. He only spread what was left of the ancient sun god. Klein originally believed that this was due to the special trait of a visionary and how he could use his uniqueness to create a bunch of realistic believers as anchors. This way, he didn't need to build a congregation, but from the looks of it, this was probably only one of the reasons. After 2 seconds of silence, he looked into Adam's pure eyes and said, "You are the ancient sun god?" Adam maintained his warm smile and said in an illuminating tone, "Don't you think I'm the most unique among the 8 kings of angels?" After reading the contents of the second blasphemy slate regarding the great old ones, you should be able to clearly understand this point. Indeed, Klein nodded, indicating that he could tell. Of the 5 kings of angels related to omnipotence and omniscience, you are the only one with a uniqueness. According to the mysticism knowledge that Klein currently possessed, when the City of Silver's creator was still alive, the 8 kings of angels were in the same state. Dark Angel Sasrur digested 2 sequence 1 characteristics of the Hanged Man pathway and controlled the first blasphemy slate, allowing him to use a portion of the power of the Chaos Sea. Therefore, he was heaven's deputy, the left hand of God, a king among kings of angels. White angel aucuses contain two sequence 1 characteristics of the sun pathway. Wind angel Leodoro, angel of wisdom Haraburgen, angel of fate Ouroboros also possess two sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of their respective pathways. Angel of time Amun, red angel Medici were the ones with a uniqueness of their own pathway and a corresponding sequence 1 beyonder characteristic. Angel of imagination Adam had the spectator pathway's uniqueness and two sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. This didn't seem problematic at first glance, but it appeared strange on careful thought. Angel of time Aman and red angel Medici didn't belong to the 5 pathways of omnipotence and omniscience, and there was no problem about the ancient sun god using different methods to give them their uniqueness. However, Adam was different. Visionary belonged to one of the 5 pathways of omnipotence and omniscience, and the corresponding uniqueness was one of the foundations needed by the ancient sun god to become a great old one. In other words, this was equivalent to one of the 3 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics needed of a sequence 0. How could it be randomly separated? After all, Sasra, as the deputy of heaven, the left hand of God, didn't obtain the uniqueness of the hanged man pathway, much less wind angel Leodoro, angel of wisdom Haraburgen, and white angel aucuses. Klein originally believed that the ancient sun god had sensed the awakening of the primordial one, so he had deliberately used the method of having children to separate one of the 5 uniquenesses from himself, taking the initiative to lower his level to resist the corruption and invasion. This was probably the thoughts of other deities and kings of angels back then. When he heard Arihog say, Adam isn't necessarily Adam, Klein felt that there might be a deeper secret hidden in this matter and came up with some guesses. After witnessing the last few lines of the second blasphemy slate, he found it even stranger. This was because a uniqueness was one of the foundations of becoming a great old one. If the Sapphira was the foundation, then the corresponding uniquenesses were weight-bearing columns. It would be deeply problematic no matter which one was lost. If the ancient sun god wanted to lower his level, the better choice would be to separate the sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. That would be relatively safer. Dressed in a simple white robe and wearing a thick golden beard, Adam walked to Klein's side and turned around. He looked at the blasphemy slate and said, "A visionary has something very special. Normal sequence 0s are made up of the uniqueness and 3 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics. Missing any one of them prevents them from being considered a true deity. They can only be considered a king of angels. And after becoming a sequence 0, a visionary is able to split 2 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics and replace the corresponding characteristic via envisioning. The object produced by envisioning is real enough. It can work perfectly under the framework of the uniqueness and a sequence 1 beyonder characteristic, allowing a visionary's level and strength to not decrease. The 2 real separated sequence 1 beyonder characteristics can be combined with one's other identity or a certain life form that's envisioned. It can make them become an author with complete freedom. When necessary, one can use a certain method or some mediums to transform him into the true form. And for the omnipotent and omniscient, he can create a uniqueness that borders between reality and illusory to maintain his state, as long as it doesn't exceed the necessary limitations. This is the relationship between Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt and his child, Dragon of Nightmare Alzahad. I once thought that the seer and marauder pathways were the most bizarre. From the looks of it, they can't compare to a spectator. Sigh, be careful of the spectator. Klein completely resolved the question on his mind. He also understood why Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt had arranged for 0-08 to meet Grozel's travels. Once they met 0-08's quill, which originated from the Dragon of Nightmare Alzahad, would awaken and become the Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt at a lower level. Then, this resurrected ancient god would use the negative persona sealed behind the bronze door to activate the Chaos Sea's power, instantly reaching the level of the strongest king of angels below that of true deities. With such a foundation, he had the chance to compete with Adam for the position of visionary and completely revive. It's simpler, neater, and cleaner compared to the Black Emperor's resurrection. Klein nodded slightly and said, "The relationship between Dragon of Imagination and the Dragon of Nightmare?" Adam sat down beside Klein. "Yes. However, the Dragon of Imagination had been corrupted, and had characteristics of other pathways, putting him in a poor condition. All he could do was separate an author. Otherwise, he would have directly lost control." Klein ignored Adam beside him and looked at the second blasphemy slate in front of him. "What's the difference between this and a marauder's avatar? If a mon can become an error, he, too, can create at least 2 sequence 1 avatars." Adam leaned forward and simply explained, "The avatar and the main body are still the same, but they are located in different areas." "Does that mean that the sequence 1 that's envisioned is completely separated from the real body and can be considered another person? Only by using some method or using some medium can one awaken?" Klein asked thoughtfully, "You awakened when you became a visionary?" "No." Adam looked straight ahead and replied with a gentle expression, "When I perished and True was born." Klein asked in surprise, "Was no one suspicious?" If the deities knew that the ancient sun god had long been resurrected in Adam, the history of the 4th epoch would most likely be to besiege the Solomon Empire, the Twilight Hermit Order, and the Aman family. Apart from True knowing about this, perhaps only Evernight had her suspicions, Adam said, his voice neither fast nor slow. "I disguised myself as a zealot wanting my father to awaken in my body. It's not difficult for a king of angels from the visionary pathway to do so." Then Medici, Klein suddenly felt pity for the Red Angel. Thinking up to this point, he lowered his head to look at the blood-stained wooden stake on his chest. He felt that he deserved more sympathy. Adam said calmly, "It was a necessary sacrifice. Why do you think he can remain alive for so many years after becoming an evil spirit without being discovered?" Klein fell silent for 2 seconds before asking, "Are you going to let me wait just like this? You can also choose to leave this corpse cathedral, but Zeratul will be waiting for you at the entrance. In your present state, you can only become his marionette," Adam said without any emotion. Klein fell silent as he read the remaining contents of the second blasphemy slate. In the fog sea, the dawn silently sailed through the undulating blue waves. Bernadette suddenly opened her eyes and sat up. She frowned and picked up an item on the table. The item was completely golden in color, and there were mysterious symbols engraved on its surface, making it look like a miniature water flask. This was sealed Artifact 0-05, Magic Wishing Lamp. Bernadette held the wishing lamp and bowed her head as she chanted an honorific name, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Chapter 1347. Pillar above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, beside the fool's seat. A prayer point of light expanded to produce a rippling halos. It was as though someone had suddenly drawn the curtains in a dark, sealed room, allowing sunlight to shine in, piercing into the eyes of the sleeping one. The whirlpool of maggots, which had already quietened down, once again went berserk as it began to flail the slippery and strange tentacles. These are the Great Old One's title corresponding to the 9 Sphirot. After reading it, Klein sighed inwardly. If he and Emperor Roselle knew this mysticism knowledge earlier, neither of them would have ended up in their present situations. At certain times, even without using Beyonder powers, knowledge is completely equivalent to power. The titles of the combined pathways of Earth and Moon are somewhat different from Mother Goddess of Depravity. From the looks of it, it is indeed just a part of her, which means that the title and authority left to the outer deity on the moon is Mother Goddess of Depravity, Origin of Evil, the Indestructible. By the same logic, the Mother Tree of Desire's full name should be Mother Tree of Desire, Heartless God, Perpetual Blather. The situation regarding the Son of Chaos isn't very clear. It's as though he vanished, and no one can fully understand him. Klein nodded indiscernibly. He then asked, "From the looks of it, the omnipotent and omniscient is the strongest. The Lord of the Mysteries and the Space-Time in One are ranked second. The rest are ranked third." This was determined by the number of beyonder pathways each needed, excluding the outer deities. Adam looked at the blasphemy slate and calmly said, "That's not how it is. The number of authorities has a certain connection to level and status, but not entirely. The corresponding characteristics, power, and symbols are equally important." After the original creators split apart, the three pillars stood above all the great old ones. One was God Almighty, omnipotent and omniscient. The other was Lord of the Mysteries, the King of Spacetime, and the last was Mother Goddess of Depravity, origin of evil. Upon hearing Adam's last sentence, Klein couldn't help but look down at his left sleeve. Rhodes was hiding inside. No wonder Rhodes said that he saw a pillar and support from me. Klein had suddenly arrived at a state of enlightenment as he was a little more convinced by what visionary Adam had said. At this moment, Adam added at an adequate pace. Currently, the first two pillars only exist in the form of spheroid. And after the Mother Goddess of Depravity had the brood hive and two beyonder pathways separated from her, she became not much different from the other outer deities. Only her symbol as a pillar remains. If it wasn't for the blood-stained stake in his chest, Klein definitely would have felt that the ambience was great for a conversation. In moments when his mind trailed, he even imagined that he and Adam were friends and were happily discussing some mysticism knowledge, waiting for his child, Amon, to return home for dinner. Of course, I'm dinner. I have to say that a spectator's ability to influence others' knowledge, experience, and state is really too powerful. As Klein told himself to be on guard, he asked in puzzlement, "I thought that the outer deities like the Mother Goddess of Depravity, who has 2 or even 3 spheroid, are considered pillars." Adam looked down at the silver cross pendant hanging across his chest and said, "She only has 1 sapphira. Under normal circumstances, the spheroid can't be separated. Only when the original creator split and created an embodiment of convergence and separation did the spheroid tear apart, allowing some of them to be sucked into our planet. In other words, the present sapphira the Mother Goddess of Depravity has is incomplete. The future Great Old One, Mother of all, won't be a complete Great Old One?" Klein pressed. Adam's lips twitched as though he was smiling. It was so at the beginning, but the spheroid has the ability to mend itself. The present Mother Goddess of Depravity's sapphira isn't incomplete, and the brood hive can also create a Great Old One itself. The only problem is that the Mother Goddess of Depravity can only use a portion of pillar she symbolizes, unless she has fused with the brood hive again. This has also caused the birth of life and the feminist powers in the entire universe to undergo a certain anomaly. However, thousands of years of time at astronomical scales is a very short period of time, and the corresponding influence hasn't spread. And if any outer deity obtains a sapphira that is neighboring theirs, making it equivalent to having 2 spheroid, I can't predict what will happen. Before that, only the original creator had contained more than singular sapphira. However, as long as he awakens, it will definitely split apart. Klein nodded and asked thoughtfully, "In the beginning, the creator accommodated at least 9 spheroid. This doesn't mean that having 2 spheroid or even 3 will not result in problems. There should be a critical point. No one can verify this at the moment." Adam held the silver cross pendant in front of his chest and said, "I'm guessing that some existences have attempted it before. After all, convergence is a very strong instinct, but the outcome is unknown." "Which existences?" Klein rubbed the bloody cross wooden stake that was stuck in his chest. Adam cast his gaze at the gigantic cross that was more than 100 meters tall in front of him, and calmly said, "The God Almighty from the early first epoch. He can also be called the primordial one. In addition, there's also the Lord of the Mysteries, the one you often recite." As he spoke, Adam turned to look at Klein and said in an imitating manner, "The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. These two seem to have vanished. The outcome of their attempts doesn't seem too good." Klein hadn't thought of what he wanted to say when Adam turned his head and looked at the second blasphemy slate. "What I can be sure of is that some spheroid cannot be accommodated at the same time. In this universe, there is a hidden 4th pillar. It represents everything, including the end of the Great Old Ones and the universe itself. It corresponds to the two Sephirot, River of Eternal Darkness and City of Calamity. Simply put, if Evernight can become an eternal darkness, singularity of all, space-time in one, she can further occupy the two pathways of Demonis and Red Priest, encompassing the City of Calamity and becoming the true fourth pillar. However, when that happens, she will either enter a deep sleep, be passively split apart, or it will cause the entire universe, including her and us, to be annihilated, starting everything all over again. Never expected that. Once above the sequences level is reached, the symbolism is more important than authority. Adam, no, the ancient sun god's mysticism knowledge is simply too terrifying. As expected of a quasi-great old one. Klein sighed when he heard that. He thought and said, in other words, a demigod from the sleepless pathway can transfer to the Demonis pathway? That's right. Adam looked straight ahead. But in that case, there's no way to become a great old one, unless one thinks of a way to separate the beyonder characteristics from before. As Klein looked up, he read the demigod potion formulas of the spectator, sleepless, and arbiter pathways and changed the topic. Where did the potion formula related to the great old ones come from? The first blasphemy slate didn't seem to contain them. Were they hidden in the different sequence 0 potions? Adam's expression changed slightly, and his face seemed to be more radiant. After I gained initial control of the omnipotence and omniscience authority, I began to deduce the method and pathway to become a great old one. Finally, I found a suitable formula and figured out the different symbolism. Unfortunately, at that time, the primordial one had also awoken inside me. Therefore, when the ancient sun god perished, you used a portion of your body and will to create a second blasphemy slate? Klein sighed and said, from now on, there will be light for the apocalypse. It also ended the chaotic battle between the deities due to anger, emotions, and other reasons. It initiated the era of working towards becoming great old ones. Adam maintained his previous expression and didn't say anything. Klein fell silent. After a few seconds, he suddenly asked, what kind of humanity did you fabricate in that marionette of mine? Adam turned head and said with clear eyes, he was too tired. He wanted rest and freedom, even if it was only for a few seconds. Klein gaped, not knowing how to respond. Why didn't you address him as Gehrman Sparrow, but refer to him as that marionette? Adam asked warmly, as though he was trying to straighten out the thoughts of a member of his congregation. Klein turned his head to look at him, and suddenly said with a smile, I'm Gehrman Sparrow. Gehrman Sparrow is a part of me. If I separate them, even if I can escape your divine kingdom, it will be difficult for me to avert the fate of losing control. Having said that, Klein paused and looked ahead. He asked in a deep voice, you only have godhood left. Rorstad Archipelago, City of Generosity, Biam. After returning here, Verdu Abraham learned that the god of war was a rather active existence in the fourth epoch. It was possible for him to respond to believers. Then he hired a poor person who willingly risked his life to pray to the god of war to confirm that there was no danger. And the price of all of that was 300 gold pounds. Now, he received a report that not only was that poor person not dead, he even had some of his wishes fulfilled. Chapter 1348 Preparation for the Ritual Blue Mountain Island, within a primitive forest. Worried that official Beyonders would discover the ritual outside the city, Verdu Abraham, who had finished making preparations, used a sealed artifact to teleport away from Biam and arrived in someplace that was nearly uninhabited. Rubbing the pain in his ribs, Verdu took off his classic robe and placed it aside. Following that, he set up an altar, lit the candles, and burnt the correct essential oils, extracts, herbal powder, etc. After finishing the setup, Verdu took 2 steps back and lowered his voice to chant in ancient Hermes, the great god of war, the symbol of iron and blood, the ruler of chaos and strife. A howling wind echoed in the dark forest. Amidst the rustling of the branches and leaves, 2 of the candles on the altar suddenly emitted crackling sounds. The corresponding candle flames rose from the size of a sapling to a towering tree. At the same time, the color of the candlelight changed from orange to bright white. The wind that passed through the forest became even more intense. Two fiery pillars of fire intertwined together, twisting into a blurry and huge figure. At that moment, Verdu Abraham felt an indescribable gaze cast from high above and onto his body. He hurriedly bowed his head and said, "Great God of War, your lowly believer would like to pray for your help." As he spoke, he kept adjusting his attitude and tried his best to remain calm. He knew from his family's books that the most important thing to take note of when praying to the God of War was to not be angry. The massive figure formed from a blinding white flame constantly spewed out flames as it used a language that Verdu could understand, but had no idea what it was. "Lowly mortal, a god is not used to satisfy your wishes. Speak, say your prayers, and I'll decide whether to help you in the end." Verdu had already drafted out his request, so he said after some thought, "Great God of War, what should I do to make my ancestor, Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham, return to the real world?" "A ritual. Sacrifice a bizarro sorcerer, a secret sorcerer, and a parasite. You should already know about it," the flaming giant said in a deep and dignified manner. "It's the same as the answer given by Dorian's student." Verdu sighed and said, "Great God of War, what must I pay to request you to complete this ritual for me?" The flaming giant looked down at the astrologer and said, "The corresponding price is not something you can afford. Your pale and puny soul isn't even qualified to be embers." Just as Verdu was disappointed and abnormally depressed, the flaming giant continued, "But Mr. Dor can. Besides, I'm in a good mood today. Sacrifice a portion of your blood to me as the mark of the contract. I will request the corresponding price from Mr. Dor." "That's possible." Verdu subconsciously had his suspicions, but after some thought, he felt that there was nothing wrong with it. Indeed, only his ancestor, Bethel Abraham, had the right to trade with a secret existence like the God of War. As for whether Mr. Dor was willing to proceed with the deal, Verdu had never considered it. From his point of view, anyone who was in an exiled and sealed state would undoubtedly want to escape, even if they had to pay a huge price. "Yes, great God of War." After pondering for a moment, Verdu agreed. He then changed the ritual and added the sacrifice and bestowment parts of a ritual. He then used a metal dagger to pierce through his arm and let out dark red blood. When his blood turned into red pearls and passed through the door of sacrifice and bestowment, it became extremely dark, as though there were countless monsters lurking in it. In the next second, an object was spat out from behind the illusory door. It was a semi-transparent meat blob with slippery tentacles. On the meat blob, twisted maggots crawled out one after another. Upon seeing the object, Verdu's head turned dizzy as though large amounts of gunk had been injected into it. At this moment, a flame landed, enveloping his body, turning his vision red. With this layer of red light, Verdu no longer suffered any anomalies when looking at the blob of meat. Right on the heels of that, another object was spat out of the door of sacrifice and bestowment. It was a bird with a deformed head. Every feather shimmered with a faint stellar radiance. Strands of insect-like brilliance drilled into its body and occasionally emanated out. Worm of stars. Is this a monster with a secret sorcerer's beyonder characteristic? The previous one corresponds to a bizarro sorcerer. Indeed, secret sorcerer and bizarro sorcerer are only names of potions. They aren't just referring to humans. It's the same with the title of demigods. Unless the term half-man is added to the title. Verdu has a deep understanding of his pathway, allowing him to understand the current situation. And this meant that the ritual to help Mr. Dor escape could be done by sacrificing demigod monsters of the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathways. Furthermore, there was no need for Verdu to do it himself. The great God of War had already prepared everything. This made it difficult for Verdu to suppress the joy in his heart. He looked at the door of sacrifice and bestowment light with great anticipation, waiting for the third sacrifice to be spat out. In just a second, an object flew out from the darkness behind the door and landed on the altar. It was an unconscious crow. Of course, it only looked like a crow. Its right eye had a ring of black, and its feathers were almost transparent. On it were rings. A monster corresponding to Parasite? Verdu was delighted as he sincerely praised the great god of war. Inside the corpse cathedral, you only have godhood left. Klein asked in a low voice as he looked at the huge cross in front of him. He felt that using a certain identity or a particular persona to revive definitely had problems. Even if the identity, the persona, had a real body, real beyonder characteristics, and a certain level of self-awareness, it still wouldn't be nearly perfect. And Adam's behavior had deepened his suspicions. Sitting beside him, Adam, who was dressed in a simple white robe, didn't show any change in expression. He maintained his composure when preaching. I'll only be complete if I fuse with true. Indeed, Klein sighed and said, although the true creator is an embodiment of negative personalities and extreme emotions, he has also inherited your humanity? That's why he went mad. Adam appeared to be speaking about a stranger. Klein thought for a moment before interpreting the remaining contents of the second blasphemy slate. He asked, if the two of you really fuse as one, who among you will take center stage? This is what we have been competing for after we awakened, Adam said as he released the hand holding the silver cross pendant. Therefore, you obtain the first blasphemy slate through Amon, hoping to use it to gain control of the Chaos Sea and gain the upper hand? Klein was enlightened as he nodded with a frown. All of you seem to have a tacit understanding regarding this matter. The true creator has never made an issue out of your identity or used external forces to deal with you. This is between us, Adam replied calmly. Klein fell silent for a few seconds before staring at the blasphemy slate. I have a nagging feeling that the Red Angel's death and many of the things that happened during the fourth epoch weren't that simple. Klein kept asking and probing. Apart from trying to understand more secrets and gain more knowledge, he was stalling for time and maintaining their present interaction. Compared to being hypnotized by Adam and turning muddle-headed, or sleeping directly, he wished to stay awake. With this in mind, Klein lowered his head to look at the blood-stained wooden stake embedded in his chest. He felt that the pain it brought was so real. Why do you say that? Adam asked in return, as if he would begin praying at any moment. Klein deliberated over his words and said, before the Black Emperor returned, the Solomon Empire only had one true god, the true creator, and the Red Priest's uniqueness. The nobles and powers who supported Alista Tudor occupied the four uniquenesses of visionary, door, error, the fool. Together, even adding on the king of angels Ouroboros, they wouldn't be able to fend off the six orthodox deities like Evernight and company. Furthermore, they still had the Justiciar uniqueness on hand. In such a situation, even if you didn't plan on scheming to target the Red Angel, no one will suspect you. Of course, a crazy Blood Emperor might be more useful to you. Adam's gaze remained unchanged as he stared at the huge cross. You don't understand because you don't know enough. In the fourth epoch, apart from the three great empires and the true deities and kings of angels behind them, there were also the Demonist sect and the Moses ascetic order. There was also the Abyss's infiltration and secretly developed artisans, as well as the southern continent's Balaam. And that wasn't all. In addition, there were many crucial factors at stake. Klein nodded thoughtfully and said, for example, the conflict between the six deities? Adam smiled warmly and said, more than that. Without waiting for Klein to ask further, Adam added calmly, you should have been to Bansi. Klein's heart stirred as he opened his mouth but didn't say a word. Adam continued, in addition, after I perished, the invasion on reality by the outer deities clearly deepened. In the ancient palace above the fog, due to the lack of response to the prayer light representing Bernadette, it kept expanding and contracting, emitting rippling halos. This provoked the vortex formed by the transparent maggots. It frantically flailed its slippery tentacles and lashed towards that direction. After repeated misses, one of the tentacles touched the correct prayer light. Chapter 1349. Door. After Bernadette received no response, she held the magic wishing lamp and walked to the window in the captain's cabin to take in the deep blue sea. She wasn't impatient, nor did she attempt to use her powers of prophecy, patiently waiting for any further developments. After a few minutes, A grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of her eyes. Right on the heels of that, the fog was dyed golden, as though it was coated with a layer of sticky syrup. Bernadette immediately bowed her head and looked at the magic wishing lamp in her hand. She saw that the wick at the mouth of the lamp had automatically ignited itself. Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, beside the fool's chair, the prayer light, which was the size of a human head, was instantly occupied by a distorted, blurry golden figure. The figure's gaze penetrated the prayer light and penetrated the grayish-white fog, looking at the maggot vortex that was attempting to destroy everything around it. His voice immediately reverberated within Sapphira Castle, dignified and grand. "You actually lost control?" The tone of Genie was clearly mocking. He didn't care whether the crazy worms of spirit could understand him. At this moment, a strange door of light formed from countless balls of light appeared above the chair of the fool that had already collapsed. It was faintly discernible and emitted a bright light, forming a complicated symbol in midair. This symbol originally existed behind the fool's chair, formed from the pupilless eye and the contorted lines. As the symbol took form, the strange light became fainter and eventually completely fused into this space. In the next second, Klein's voice came from the symbol representing the fool. "Genie, I want to make a deal with you." The blurry and distorted figure immediately laughed. I said that you would eventually agree." After laughing for a few seconds, Genie calmed down and said, "I was just wondering how is it possible for the new owner of Sapphira Castle to so easily lose control. This was a preparation I made for the worst-case scenario." The voice in the symbol of the fool wasn't impatient at all. Genie laughed and said, "Aren't you afraid that I'll raise the price at the last minute?" Klein replied unhurriedly, "This is just one of my preparations, but for you, it might be the only chance for many years." Genie's light gold figure swayed as though it had been blown by a gust of wind as a grand voice sounded. "My condition is the same as before. As long as you can remove the seal and release me, I will take what belongs to me back to the cosmos. I will leave the rest to you and grant you 3 wishes. Of course, from the looks of it, you seem to need my advance payment." Klein's voice sounded again from the symbol of the fool. "The promise I'll give you is to send the magic wishing lamp into the cosmos before the end of 1368 in this epic age. As for how you get out of your predicament, that is your own problem. My request is even simpler, and I only need 2 wishes. This is the deal I'm talking about. Whether you agree with it is up to you." 1368 was the year when the oldest one's barrier disappeared. It was acknowledged by the world's prophets as the apocalypse. The blurry and distorted figure fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "If you don't remove the seal, the wishes I can grant will be very limited. Once it exceeds a certain level, it will be granted in an extremely twisted fashion." Inside the symbol of the fool that was cast with a brilliant light, Klein's calm voice sounded, "You can fulfill the 2 wishes I need now." Genie fell silent again and didn't speak for a long time. Biam, inside the primitive forest. Verdu, who was burning up both internally and externally, didn't waste any time. According to the god of war's instructions, he modified the altar and engraved the correct symbols, magic labels, and strange patterns. He was originally worried that the 3 demigod monsters would suddenly wake up, but when the ritual was ready, the sacrificial items remained unconscious, unable to resist. After placing the squirming meat blob, the deformed star bird, and the white raven with a dark eye circle onto the right spot, Verdu looked at the only candle on the altar and lit it. Then he took a few steps back and chanted solemnly in Jotun, "Great door of all doors, guide of the endless cosmos, key to all mysterious worlds. I pray for your response, praying for you to descend into this world." Before he could finish his sentence, 3 loud bangs sounded from the altar. The 3 demigod monsters that corresponded to Bizarro Sorcerer, Secret Sorcerer, and Parasite seemed to be being held by an invisible hand. They only struggled slightly before exploding, turning into blobs of flesh and blood that shimmered with different colors. The flesh and blood seemed to have a life of its own. Under the guidance of some indescribable force, they gathered in the air, forming strange and filthy symbols. Countless symbols combined together, forming a huge door that was still squirming like flesh and blood, one that was more than 5 meters tall. The door stood on the altar. It was pitch black inside, and it was unknown where it went. Flames from the candle representing Mr. Door suddenly soared, illuminating the entire door of flesh and blood, illuminating the darkness within. In the darkness, there were tiny balls of stellar light condensing into spherical lights. On closer inspection, they looked like strange insects with bent bodies. The spherical light rapidly rose, forming a gigantic arm that passed through the doors of flesh and blood. This arm, which clearly didn't belong to a human, pressed against the altar and forcefully squeezed out, causing the entire door of blood and flesh to shake. Even the forest and the entire island began to shake as though it was an earthquake. Verdu watched this scene happily, and his vision suddenly blurred. But something fell from his face into the bushes. Verdu subconsciously lowered his head and saw an eye with bulging blood vessels rolling around. His nose, ears, and remaining eye, as well as his muscles, plopped to the ground one after another, each seeping with a stellar radiance. Thump. His body collapsed as his flesh and blood completely collapsed. At that moment, the arm finally squeezed through the door of flesh and blood and attempted to pull out the rest of its body. Boom! In the darkness behind the door, thick lightning bolts formed a storm and descended, but they were swallowed by the sudden appearance of a blood-colored tide. Finally, a gigantic figure formed from pure spherical lights passed through the door of flesh and blood. In the next second, the spherical light began to collapse and fold, as though they were going to undergo a qualitative change. Following that, dark cracks appeared out of the void in the surrounding forest. These cracks directly engulfed the different parts of the trees, turning them into strange shapes. At the same time, a hurricane from unknown origins blew out from a crack and swept in all directions. The entire Blue Mountain Island that Byam was on trembled as though it was about to sink. Inside the Cathedral of Waves, Alger Wilson, who was vexed over failing to monitor Verdu after he teleported, suddenly heard the sounds of doors opening. Every door in the city was opened automatically at this moment. Alger turned his head and looked into the forest outside the city that seemed to be the source of the anomaly. The moment the door opened, Derek, who had been woken up by the earthquake, frowned. Frick, frick, frick. In the cities like Backlund, Trier, and St. Millum, all things that could be called doors opened. Above the gray fog, in the half-collapsed ancient palace, the crazy maggot vortex instinctively attacked the light gold figure and the fool symbol, but nothing came out of it. After nearly a minute, Genie suddenly chuckled. "You really aren't him. Otherwise, I'd have distorted the promise you made just now and made his seal be removed automatically. This effect can only be achieved by twisting the original owner's words. You previously used this method to realize that I'm not the Lord of the Mysteries?" Klein's voice sounded from the symbol of the fool. Genie scoffed and said, "I have at least 10 ways to verify that it's him." Without waiting for Klein's reply, the pale gold figure smiled and said, "You don't seem like you can maintain this state for too long. All right, the deal has been made. After I complete your 2 wishes, you must send the magic wishing lamp into the cosmos before 1368 of this epoch." Genie's voice gradually turned solemn, as if he was proclaiming a law. At that moment, he seemed to have established a particular rule based on this deal. There was no need to worry that Klein would go back on his word in the future. If you can't fulfill this promise, even if you become the Lord of the Mysteries, you will perish and split, warned the genie as he asked, "Tell me your 2 wishes. Take note. Don't involve higher-level Beyonder characteristics, and don't exceed the limit of my present powers. Otherwise, the wish will be granted in a distorted way. This is a rule that has been set. I can't violate it now." In the symbol of the fool that was outlined by the bright light, Klein's voice calmly said, "The first wish, the 2 wishes that Bernadette Gustave previously made are to be brought under my name. This should be very simple for you." Genie immediately said with a smile, "Indeed, you want to make use of the terrible outcome from making a 3rd wish to deal with your current predicament. Not bad, this is something that stems from my level. I will satisfy your wish and let you die in pain." Klein's voice sounded again. The second wish, let my utopia give rise to a corresponding region in the spirit world. This doesn't involve the advancement of a sequence, nor does it have anything to do with higher-level Beyonder characteristics. You can definitely do it. Genie's light gold figure wavered before he said with a smile, your wish will be granted. Inside the corpse cathedral, Klein touched the bloody wooden stake on his chest, as though he was considering how to get it out. During this process, he casually asked Adam, you didn't attempt to become a god in the fourth epic because you didn't obtain 0-08? It was one factor. More importantly, there were still many latent dangers that haven't been resolved at that time. Adam looked at the huge cross in front of him, with a warm gaze. Klein turned his head to the side and looked at the visionary and said, for example, during that period, the remnant will of the primordial one was still very strong. Before he finished his sentence, a large amount of bright red blood flowed down Klein's head. However, the corner of his lips curled up slightly. Chapter 1350 Wish. Adam turned his head and looked at Klein. His limpid, light-colored eyes reflected the face that was stained with blood. His expression remained unchanged, and there was a hint of pity in its warmth. It was as if a god was looking down upon the world. Klein smiled at him as his head cracked apart. This trend on his body caused him to collapse into a pool of blood. In the pool of blood were his clothing, the blood-soaked stake, and an ancient mirror. In the corpse cathedral, in the divine kingdom of visionary Adam, Klein had died a strange death. Adam, dressed in a simple white robe, looked at the scene before him, with gentleness and calmness. It was unknown if he had expected it or if he had avoided having any emotions. In the ancient palace above the fog, that crazy maggot vortex instantly stopped as they broke apart into numerous frozen, dead worms of spirit. In the next second, these worms of spirit turned illusory as they became stained with grayish-white as though they had fused into the fog of history. Then they came back to life. As they shimmered with a dark glow, they gathered together. In just a few seconds, the worms of spirit reassembled into a figure. It was Klein Moretti, who had black hair, brown eyes, and a formal suit. With the return of the owner of Sapphira Castle, the destroyed modeled table and the 22 high-back chairs rapidly restored to normal. The junk scattered all over the floor was piled up again. Klein picked up the staff of the stars embedded with various gems and sat on the seat belonging to the fool. The entire space above the gray fog quaked as boundless and mighty invisible forces surged out. Klein immediately nodded at the golden figure that occupied Bernadette's prayer. I will fulfill my promise. Genie laughed and said, it looks like you haven't inherited his cunningness and shamelessness. Very good. As soon as he said that, the blurry and distorted golden figure rapidly receded, no longer projecting itself on Bernadette's prayer light. Well done. As Klein separated a worm of spirit to respond to Queen Mystic's prayers, he lowered his head and made a wish to himself. I wish to be restored to how I was like before tonight. When his main body died, he had only taken away the core portion of the Miracle Invoker Beyonder characteristic, leaving behind the remains in Adam's corpse cathedral. He was unable to retrieve them. Of course, Klein still had a large portion of the characteristics in the worms of spirit in his body above the gray fog and the remaining marionettes in Utopia. Zeratul didn't need any additional Beyonder characteristics, nor did he want them to end up affecting his condition. Therefore, he didn't directly use the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics to suck all the characteristics of the same pathway in Utopia. He collected them using a different method which was relatively slow and would require a certain amount of time. After making this wish, Klein summoned the curtain, draped it behind him, and snapped his fingers. Inside the junk pile, the Seer Pathways Sequence 9 and 3 Beyonder characteristics that were separated from the curtain previously floated up at the same time, transforming into pure light dots that drilled into Klein's body. His condition instantly returned to the time when he was almost done digesting the Miracle Invoker potion. Apart from the lack of a physical body, he was no different from when he was attacked. Right on the heels of that, Klein cast his gaze at Utopia, which was closely connected to him. Inside Utopia, The hooded, black-robed Zeratul, whose face was covered in white whiskers, stood on the roof of St. Ariana Cathedral. Beside him were Roselle Gustav's, William Augustus's, and Abomination Sua's historical projection. They patiently waited for the door to the corpse cathedral to open and for Gehrman Sparrow to walk out. He controlled some of his marionettes, dealing with a few of the mutated utopian marionettes, leaving the remaining portion of marionettes which remained normal to the end. At that moment, dense, illusory spirit body threads suddenly floated up from the rigid utopian marionettes into an infinitely high height away. They instantly came to life and turned around, looking at Zeratul and his historical projections. The pairs of eyes sparkled in the darkness. At the same time, a huge shadow descended from the faint grayish-white fog, enveloping the entirety of Utopia. Zeratul and his historical projections instinctively raised their heads and looked up at the sky that suffused a faint gray fog. Sealing is prohibited here. In the next second, William Augustine's historical projection raised the sword in his right hand and solemnly made an announcement. The shadow that enveloped Utopia immediately shook as many gaps appeared. It was unable to completely isolate the marionette town from the outside world. Roselle Gustav's historical projection immediately transformed into a torrent of information that surged towards Klein's remaining marionettes in an attempt to interfere with their movements. As for the historical projection of Abomination Sua, it attacked the shadow that appeared like a curtain in a bid to expand the corresponding gaps. Zeratul extended his hand and grafted the void in front of him to another island in the Berserk Sea that he had previously fixed. Following that, as long as he took a step forward, he would be able to leave Utopia. At that moment, Klein's marionettes snatched the opportunity before the torrent of information entered their spirit bodies. At the same time, they opened their mouths and chanted in Jotun, Leotaro. In the forsaken land of the gods, with the remnant divine powers of a tyrant, Klein could directly trigger the power of a deity based on this name alone, but that wasn't the case in the outside world. As for whether or not he wanted to punish the fellow for calling out his true name, it was decided by the Lord of Storms. Klein had his marionettes recite the honorific name at the same time only to get the Lord of Storms to cast his gaze over. As one of the members of the 5 pathways of omnipotence and omniscience, the Lord of Storms was probably one of the true deities that didn't wish for Adam's plot to succeed. If Amon became the Lord of the Mysteries, the King of Space-Time, this tyrant would be in a very dangerous situation. He would have to constantly worry that the Son of the Creator would deal with him and help Adam or the true Creator to ascend to the position of the Lord of the astral world. Therefore, compared to the Evernight Goddess and Earth Mother, Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom were probably the existences who didn't wish to see Adam and Amon succeed. If there was a chance, Klein planned on getting his marionettes to continue shouting Aucuses and Heraburgen. Utopia's surroundings instantly turned gloomy, as if it contained the indescribable wrath of nature. Before Zeratul could take that step, the night sky instantly produced different colors of lightning. They bared their fangs and brandished their claws as they wantonly expanded. They seemed to envelop the entire sky in a sea of lightning. Boom, boom. Before the deafening sounds could be heard, the lightning blasted like a torrential rain at Utopia. The Rorstad Archipelago, New City of Silver, the top of the spire. Derek Berg, who was looking at the source of the earthquake, heard the sound of doors and windows opening at the same time. Furthermore, it repeated thousands of times. Although it didn't bring him any direct danger, the bizarre change still made Derek very wary. With some hesitation, he prepared to seek out the current chief, Waite Chermont, and suggest using the God-level sealed artifact, Proof of Glory. He wanted to first protect the New City of Silver and the nearby New Moon City. Then he decided to pray to Mr. Fool based on the progress of the anomaly. Just as he turned around and walked to the door, Waite Chermont, who had a dark blue symbol engraved on his head, walked out from the corridor's light. He said in a deep voice, "The seal underground has failed." The seal has failed. Derek instinctively believed that it had something to do with the anomaly in Blue Mountain Island. Compared to doors and windows opening, the consequences of the seal's failure were extremely terrifying. Immediately use the proof of glory, Derek said without hesitation. This was a god-level sealed artifact that could be used for a short period of time. It had once helped the city of Silver avert repeated disasters in the forsaken land of the gods, allowing them to persist until the present era and obtain salvation. Derek's thoughts were very clear. He was using the proof of glory to suppress the other god-level sealed artifact, Gift of the Land. The suppression effect would soon affect the saint-level sealed artifacts that would have negative effects on the surroundings. Wait, Chermont didn't say anything else. He immediately made up his mind and brought Derek underground using the light as concealment. Proof of glory required at least 2 saints before it could be utilized. This was also the reason why Wait Chermont didn't immediately head underground and came to find Derek first. Of course, if he wanted to make use of it simply, there were tricks to do so, but he had to be prepared in advance to brand the corresponding mark on his body. Biome, Cathedral of Waves. A bolt of lightning shot into Alger Wilson's room, turning into a hurried voice. Your Eminence, most of the underground seals have failed. Only certain items remain in a balanced state thanks to their effects. Alger's brows twitched as he combined it with the phenomena of opening doors and windows in Biome City happening at the same time. He sensed that something was amiss. He immediately said to the void, all of you immediately form groups of 3. Take out the grade 2 and 3 sealed artifacts that won't cause immediate danger, or those with living characteristics from underground to prevent any chain reactions. This way, the underground area would become uninhabited. The dangerous sealed artifacts wouldn't be able to cause casualties within a short period of time. With the passage of time, when the anomaly of the seals losing their effects passed, the mandated punishers would have the time to deal with the items. However, the premise was that they hadn't lost control of the 3 grade 1 sealed artifacts. Once there was a problem with them, the negative effects would soon affect the entirety of Biome. However, with the seal no longer working, it was very difficult for the 3 items to remain without problems. The first thought that flashed through Alger's mind was to bring along the one whose negative effects had the greatest range. Then, using his own powers to make temporary restrictions, he would fly to the sea and away from Biome. This wasn't too dangerous for him for a short period of time. After all, he was a demigod. The biggest problem was that the remaining 2 grade 1 sealed artifacts would undoubtedly cause serious damage to Biome. At least I did my best. Alger felt that this method was safe and could handle the subsequent investigations from the Church of the Lord of Storms. It was pretty good. His gaze subconsciously looked out of the window. It corresponded to the few schools and the workhouses near the cathedral. Alger retracted his gaze and fell silent for 2 seconds before sighing. He continued, "Leave the rest to me." His words transformed into electric waves that transformed into silver lightning that flew underground. Chapter 1351. Seizing the opportunity while transmitting information to the mandated punishers, Alger quickly came up with a plan in his mind. He was to immediately pray to the Lord of Storms, hoping to obtain the Lord's blessings or help. Then he would immediately rush underground and use his Beyonder powers to forcefully suppress the 3 grade 1 sealed artifacts inside Azure Gate. During this process, if the Lord of Storms responded to his prayers, or if the abnormality regarding the seals ended in time, there was naturally no need for him to consider any other response. However, if neither of the 2 outcomes occurred, and he began to find it difficult to handle the situation, then he would seek Mr. Fool's help. To Alger, once he had to do so, no matter what method he used or how he concealed it, it would be difficult for him to escape the fate of being suspected. After all, it was unbelievable for a single person to suppress 3 grade 1 sealed artifacts single-handedly. When the time came, his only option was to immediately abandon his post after the abnormality ended or the seal began working again. His departure would waste all his years of diligence and hard work, causing him to lose his post as cardinal which he had painstakingly obtained. However, compared to his own life, this was a price he was willing to pay. As for the consequences resulting in him almost not having any chance of obtaining the Book of Calamity, Alger didn't care about it at the moment. He was still a great distance from considering such problems. Of course, as a demigod of the Church of Storms and a cardinal, he believed that he was definitely under the watch of the Lord of Storms. After abandoning his job and escaping, he needed the protection of other existences to survive. Otherwise, his outcome would be unimaginable. And regarding this matter, he could only rely on Mr. Fool. Taking a deep breath, Alger quickly chanted, "The king ruling over the skies, the emperor who controls the seas, the great god of storms, I pray for your watch and pray for your blessings." After chanting, Alger reached out with his hand, bringing with him a hurricane as he flew underground. About 10 seconds later, outside the Cathedral of Waves, there was a tidal wave that surged into the air. The blue sea water poured down, enveloping the cathedral in a thick barrier. Inside the barrier, silver bolts of lightning flashed as they drilled underground. Rumble! The lightning struck down like torrential rain, illuminating all of Utopia, illuminating more than half of the Berserk Sea. At that moment, a pitch-black cathedral with many embedded skulls appeared in midair. It was situated above Zeratul, and drew all the surrounding lightning towards it, causing bolts of lightning to snake across the countless white skulls, causing the stained glass to reflect a bright light. Rumble! In the places Adam's corpse cathedral couldn't shelter, Zeratul's marionettes, Abomination Sua's historical projection, as well as Klein's marionettes, were instantly obliterated by the tempestuous lightning. Then they either vanished or were reduced to tiny marks. Even Roselle Gustav's historical projection that had turned into a flux of information wasn't spared. A strong electromagnetic hurricane wreaked havoc in the city, destroying all information structures. Taking advantage of the moment the visionary was fending off the tyrant, Zeratul took a step forward and entered the void ahead. And this void was connected to another island he had previously set in the Berserk Sea, using his beyonder powers of an attendant of mysteries. The distance between the two was reduced to 0. The black-robed, hooded Zeratul quickly vanished into the void illuminated by lightning. But in the next second, he didn't appear on the distant island, but above the Iris' hotel in Utopia. Just a moment ago, when Zeratul was stunned by the might of the storm, Klein, who was in Sapphira Castle, took the opportunity to use the curtain that was draped over his body and used the power of the Sapphira to forcefully graft the void in front of his target to the Iris' hotel. He had secretly changed Zeratul's key arrangement. This was the suppression effect of a king of angels against a sequence one angel of the same pathway. Rumble! The ceaseless lightning smote down, enveloping Zeratul, who had long and white whiskers on his face. Zeratul's pitch-black eyes didn't show any change in expression. His body rapidly faded and disappeared in the bolts of lightning. He had only come in the form of a historical void projection. His true body was hiding in a particular fragment in the fog of history. Sitting in the fool's chair, Klein immediately cast his gaze at the grayish-white fog below him, as well as the countless spots of light in the fog. He was temporarily unable to find Zeratul because the latter definitely used a secret fragment of history that only he or a very small number of existences knew. However, being unable to find him didn't mean that Klein could only watch and patiently wait until Zeratul reached his limits and was unable to stay in the fog of history. As the owner of Sapphira Castle and an existence with the level of a king of angels, Klein's preliminary control of the Sapphira was already enough to complete many things. In the next second, Klein opened the box and summoned the Fool card, accommodating it inside his body. In the blink of an eye, he transformed into the Fool who wore colorful clothes and a gorgeous headdress. He exuded a deep, terrifying aura, as well as a somewhat ridiculous feeling. The entire Sapphira Castle began to shake gently. The Fool Klein held the end of the Staff of the Stars in his right hand and struck the edge of the long mottled table. In the real world, grayish-white fog appeared, one that had a faintly visible ancient palace situated high above. In the ancient and majestic palace, a strange light formed from countless spherical lights quickly outlined itself, emitting an invisible and terrifying suction force. The fog of history instantly boiled as Zeratil's figure quickly appeared in a spot where Klein hadn't lit up. He was hoisted up without being able to stop it. Law of Beyonder characteristics convergence. With the help of Sapphira Castle, Klein projected the convergence power of Beyonder characteristics into the fog of history. At this moment, Zeratil's black-robed and hooded figure collapsed and became a pale paper figurine. His true body appeared on another island in the Berserk Sea. He quickly used the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder powers to connect the convergence inclination effect to various paper figurines. Seizing the opportunity given to him by the paper figurines, Zeratil quickly made a wish. I wish for my Beyonder characteristic to temporarily calm down. Just as he finished speaking and pressed his palms together, he had already caught sight of his fulfilled wish. This allowed him to escape the suction force from Sapphira Castle, the Fool card, and the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder characteristic collective. At the same time, he took a step back and accurately stepped on a milky white rock. The stone had long been connected to somewhere else by him, and had been solidified in some form. As Zeratil stepped down, his figure instantly vanished. It was unknown where he had gone, but the stone seemed to experience extreme weathering as it disintegrated. The Fool Klein cast his gaze down from an infinite height and scanned his surroundings, but he couldn't find Zeratil. This meant that the other party had left his line of sight. Without any hesitation, Klein immediately placed his focus on something else. He had already made all the gems on the Staff of the Stars light up as he simulated the Marauder Pathway's ability to deceive rules. He changed the location of his body's revival to a marionette that wasn't in Utopia. Previously, a few residents of Utopia had gone to other cities for various reasons. By going there, they would further deepen their relationship with the real world. Klein had chosen a travel enthusiast. He was now in a particular mountain range. As the second half of his resurrection was carried out, Klein took out the Fool card. He summoned the 9 unique spirit world specialties he had prepared previously and placed them together with the curtain. Right on the heels of that, he used the Staff of the Stars to activate the power of Sapphira Castle and once again simulated the powers of the Marauder Pathway's ability to deceive the rules, allowing the 9 spirit world specialties and that curtain to become a part of his body. In the next second, countless fragments of light appeared around the marionette that was halfway up the mountain. And inside the marionette's body, a worm of spirit flew out. It kept fracturing and fused with the fragments of light. Soon, the fragments of light condensed into a ball of light as it solidified into Klein's figure. Just as Klein's figure finished outlining, he turned into transparent maggots that scattered in all directions, allowing the curtain and the 9 spirit world specialties to drop to the ground. Then, the worms of spirit completed the reassembly process, and part of them turned into a half-top hat, a shirt, a vest, a formal suit, and trousers. Klein didn't waste any time. He immediately grabbed the curtain and the specialties of the spirit world and began to carefully concoct the potion. To him, this was the best time to advance to Attendant of Mysteries. On the one hand, the effects of the ritual had been completed with the help of the genie. This wouldn't last long, and it would gradually disappear. On the other hand, Adam, who was most likely to destroy his ritual, was being suppressed by the Lord of Storms and had no time to interfere. If he were to consume the potion and advance to sequence 1 at any other time, Klein was really worried that visionary Adam would make use of the sea of collective subconscious to inject a negative emotion into him at a critical moment. That way, losing control was inevitable. The reason why he had called Leotaro wasn't to deal with Zeratil, but to hold back the true god, Adam. During the Attendant of Mysteries ritual, there was no way to use the power of Sapphira Castle to produce a nascent form of a divine kingdom in advance, isolating Klein from the outside world. This would result in the ritual being unable to establish a connection with the corresponding region in the spirit world, resulting in failure. In less than 10 seconds, a potion that was as dark as the night sea appeared in Klein's palm. At the same time, the figure left in Sapphira Castle snapped his fingers, granting the small number of wishes accumulated in the prayer lights and the crimson stars, allowing him to digest the last bit of his miracle invoker potion. The figure inside Sapphira Castle immediately faded away, allowing Klein's body to become complete so that he could consume the potion in his best condition. As the lightning lit up the sea once again, Klein raised his right hand and brought the bottle that came from his marionette to his mouth. He gulped down the potion that was as light as air. Chapter 1352 Attendant of Mysteries. As the Attendant of Mysteries potion entered his body, Klein immediately felt a burgeoning feeling. In the blink of an eye, he lost his perception of his body and worms of spirit. He watched helplessly as they dissipated and fused into the spirit world that couldn't be described with ordinary words or common sense. It was as though he was about to disintegrate into abstract and random pieces of information. At that moment, Klein only barely maintained his consciousness and had self-awareness. Just like that, he floated in the spirit world filled with countless strange figures. After losing the ability to sense his body and be under characteristics, he began to experience all kinds of thoughts, information, knowledge, symbols, and labels. He completely lost himself and was teetering on the border of fusing with the spirit world. If this continued, Klein would definitely be completely lost, but at this moment, there was a connection between the spirit world and his consciousness. That place corresponded to a town. The people inside lived ordinary lives. They had their own names, their stories, and their fates. They intertwined with each other, bringing about complete information in the spirit world, which was the concept of abstractness. This town was eventually destroyed by a calamity and buried in the dust of history. Klein dispersed like a mist, almost fusing into the spirit world's body. Under the guidance of fate, he fused with the spirit world projection of the different utopian marionettes, allowing him to become corporeal again. Biam, deep underground in the Cathedral of Waves, in a room that was no longer sealed. Alger extended his hands and pressed down on the door in front of him. The surface of the door was blue in color, with numerous mysterious and odd reliefs protruding out. It was ajar, and there was no light behind the door. It was unknown which world it was connected to. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own. At this moment, a stream of water silently surged out, eroding the surrounding area. Bang! Alger's feet exerted strength, causing the ground to crack and spew out scarlet, nearly white, lava. This was a calamity he had created. His goal was to prevent the darkness from advancing. However, after the surging lava entered the darkness, it disappeared without a trace. The darkness shrank back a little and paused for a second before continuing its corrosion. Boom! Alger continuously created hurricanes, torrential rain, and lightning calamities, blocking the darkness again and again. He held the azure gate firmly with both hands, not letting it open further. If he were to only face this Grade 1 sealed artifact, Alger would have been completely fine. He would even have the capacity to attempt sealing it, but at that moment he still had two similarly dangerous items around him. This forced him to sing loudly. He used the melody of death to influence his surroundings and disrupt the operations of the other sealed artifacts. Then he built a wall formed from blue seawater beside him. However, the wall was slowly being dyed grayish-white, as if it had been petrified. Yet, the pandemonium didn't yield as it extended towards Alger's body. I can last for at most 30 seconds. The Lord of Storms hasn't responded the entire time. Thoughts raced through Alger's mind as he suppressed his unwillingness and reluctance. He quickly made a decision. Without any hesitation, he immediately accentuated a hexagonal crystalline snowflake on his palm. This was the mark left behind after he participated in the Tarot Club for the first time. It could substitute the reciting of an honorific name and allow Mr. Fool to cast his gaze over Blue Mountain Island within the primitive forest. At the door of flesh and blood, spherical lights collapsed and converged in an attempt to undergo a qualitative change. They seemed to form a body consisting of a series of doors. The body wore the blood-colored tidal wave as its robe as its body constantly warped and changed, reflecting different regions and planets. At this moment, a blinding ray of sunlight shone through the darkness. It descended from the astral world and melted everything it encountered along the way. Other than this ray of sunlight, an inscrutable darkness of the night surged over, attempting to devour Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham, who was seeking to advance to Sequence 0. The land where the altar was quaked violently, tearing open a huge hole in a bid to devour the door of flesh and blood, and Bethel Abraham to fall deep into the core and face the chaos sea that contained all possible colors and possibilities. Following that, a blurry light seeped out from the void and enveloped the forest, attempting to restore the basic structure of the trees, mud, and altar. And at the only gap in the light, a pair of brass-colored eyes emerged. They stared at the door of flesh and blood and Bethel Abraham, hoping to reflect them into their eyes. Mr. Dor let out a low roar, causing his blood-colored robe to flare up. The robe connected to the evil tide that surged behind the door of flesh and blood, spreading out to the crimson moonlight. The moment it touched the moonlight, the inscrutable night that could not be seen gathered on its own. It stretched out its limbs and head, turning into a shadowy female human. It possessed its own life, and its consciousness was no longer controlled by its user. Without any exception, the blinding sunlight transformed into a young man wearing fiery armor. The shaking ground grew eyes and closed its mouth. The screen that was transformed from a faint light revealed terrifying facial features. Around the brass-colored eyes, eyelashes emerged, transforming into wings. These obstructions and interferences fell into chaos, giving Mr. Dor a chance for a breather. Seizing this opportunity, he entered the final step of becoming a god. At that moment, the door of flesh and blood suddenly collapsed and covered Mr. Dor's body, making him seem to turn into another person. Klein's body seemed to dissociate into countless people. They had their own preferences, their personalities, their determination, and their fates. They lived in a town known as Utopia. These people quickly lived their short lifespans, waking up under the heavy storm. They came to their senses and realized what their identity was in essence. It was Zhou Mingrue, and also Klein Moretti. They were also Sherlock Moriarty, Gehrman Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. One thing could have many names, but its nature wouldn't change. The people raised their heads and looked up into infinity from the illusory city in the spirit world. They saw the illusory and thin spirit body threads, and they saw a symbol made up of the pupilless eye and the partially contorted lines. With the symbol as the core, Klein's figure outlined itself, his eyes tightly shut. Worms of spirit, bits of Beyonder characteristics, and bits of his self-awareness flew out from the spirit world corresponding to the Utopia area and towards Klein's slightly illusory body, allowing it to slowly become corporeal. At this point, there was no clear boundary between Klein's spirit body and his physical body. They were both one and separate, and also in a rather delicate state. In other words, a spirit body could be equivalent to a body of flesh and blood. His physical body could also fuse with his spirit body. As long as Klein was willing, he could switch between two states. Of course, he could also separate his physical body from his spirit body. All of them had their individual traits, and they could be decided based on a mere thought. 2 seconds later, the reassembly process was completed. Klein, who was floating in the depths of the spirit world, opened his eyes. His pupils were dark, without any light. He had already advanced to Sequence 1 and became an attendant of mysteries. Without a sound, a grayish-white fog appeared behind him. Above the fog was an ancient palace. Inside the palace stood a door that was stained bluish-black, formed from countless spherical lights. The door of light appeared rather clearly in the spirit world. It separated out a rather blurry phantom and cast it at Klein's body. As the phantom turned into a complicated symbol, it imprinted itself between Klein's brows. The entire spirit world and the real world outside began to gently shake as though they had encountered an earthquake from afar. At that moment, Klein's surroundings turned dark as illusory stars appeared one after another. They surrounded the strange door of light as though they wanted to lump together. In these illusory stars, the largest 2 overlapped and corresponded to an area in the real world. The 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th stars were located somewhere else. Through these illusory stars, Klein saw Mr. Dor and Amon on a particular island. He saw Antigonus in the dilapidated palace inside the concealed world, and Zeratul who was hiding somewhere unknown. He saw Palaz Zorost in Leonard's body and dark demonic wolf Kotor. With the help of the changes caused by further deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, Klein found the angels and kings of angels corresponding to the three pathways of mysteries. Of course, such a vision only lasted for a few seconds. Once Amon and Zeratul reacted and used the correct method to conceal themselves, Klein would no longer be able to lock onto their true bodies. Without any hesitation, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The staff of the stars that was originally placed in Sapphira Castle had appeared in his palm. He also split a portion of the worms of spirit to let them enter Sapphira Castle to prevent any abnormalities and respond to his believers. After becoming an attendant of mysteries, Klein's control over Sapphira Castle deepened, allowing him to take out items from inside at any time. In the next second, the various gems on the staff of the stars lit up as Klein's figure vanished from the spirit world. He instantly wandered to a swamp and arrived in front of Zeratul. Dressed in a hood and a black robe, the white-bearded Zeratul didn't panic. He used his attendant of mysteries beyonder powers to make all kinds of connections as he extended his left hand and grabbed into the void ahead. Gradually, Alger's body turned grayish-white, almost about to petrify. Could it be that Mr. Fool doesn't favor me because of my failure to monitor Verdu? He frowned slightly, wanting to give up, but he stayed underground. At that moment, a grayish-white fog appeared in front of him. All the sealed artifacts fell silent. After Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham was enveloped by the door of flesh and blood, a familiar voice echoed in his ears. You wish to bring the disaster back to the real world? Bethel Abraham's actions instantly slowed down. Give up. I have a way to deal with it. I'll let you sleep and let you get the peace you want. That familiar voice sounded again. Chapter 1353 Sacrificial victim. Mr. Dor's figure that had shrunk from the ball of light came to a halt as though he had fallen into an intense internal struggle. The layered doors in his body were just a little short of fully being reassembled. Amidst the illusory whooshing sounds, the crimson tide that barely squeezed through the gap in the door of flesh and blood became even more turbulent. The blood-colored robe landed heavily, about to envelop Bethel Abraham once again. However, as it descended, the brass-colored eyes, the young man in the fiery armor, the hazy barrier of light that accentuated terrifying facial features, the ground with opened eyes and closed mouth, and the shadowy woman vanished silently from the world. In that instant, a blazing sun appeared above the forest. Day replaced the night, causing all the shadows to rapidly disperse. This caused the blood-colored robe to rise once again, scattering even more crimson moonlight, causing all the disturbances to return to their mother's embrace. Seizing this opportunity, Mr. Dor's illusory eyes closed as he lowered his head. All right. He painfully said the first word after his return to reality. His figure completely froze as he raised his right hand and pressed it to his face. The next second, Mr. Dor lifted his head and wore a crystal monocle on his right eye. A beam of light erupted from the monocle, illuminating the entire world. At that moment, all the errors of the seals that had failed were fixed. Everything that seemed normal showed errors. All the clocks jumped several seconds forward. The Marauder Sequence Zero Errors ritual was to replace someone during their apotheosis ritual. And Mr. Dor's return seemed to directly trigger his apotheosis ritual. The light converged immediately, and Mr. Dor had turned into Amon with his pointed hat and classic black robe. The blasphemer held a simple and unadorned key that seemed to be forged from pure starlight in his hand. Above him, the blood-colored robe descended, wanting to embrace him into its arms. Behind him, the crimson tide angrily squeezed through the remnants of the door of flesh and blood in a last bid to enter the world. In that short moment, the blood-colored moon glowed even brighter, blocking the sun, night, earth, blurry light, and the strange white tower outside. Faced with the corruption from an outer deity, Amon's lips curled up slightly. He extended his right hand and took out an abnormally ancient stone slab from an unknown location. The first blasphemy slate. Then he used the stone slab formed from the chaos sea to block the remnant opening of the door of flesh and blood. Then he used it as a substitute to receive the falling blood-colored robe. The first blasphemy slate turned illusory, as though it was connected to an infinite sea that contained all the possible colors. The sea surged and swallowed the blood-colored robe, blocking the crimson tide from the cosmos. The already collapsed door of flesh and blood rapidly shrank before quickly disappearing. An angry and terrifying roar resounded in the air from within. In the next second, the crimson moon appeared in the sky. The color quickly faded and turned pure. On it was a huge, distorted, crimson figure. Wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, Amon adjusted the monocle on his right eye and waved his hand at the crimson figure and the bright moon that were staring at him. He then smiled and bowed slightly in all directions. In the corpse cathedral that had an erected gigantic cross where countless skulls were watching with their hollow eyes. Adam, who was dressed in a simple white robe, took a look at the ceaseless lightning outside the stained glass. He slowly got up and walked to the pool of blood that Klein had left behind. He bent down and picked up the ancient and mysterious mirror. Following that, he turned around and walked towards the second blasphemy slate. The first figure that Zeratul summoned out of the fog of history was still Roselle Gustav, who wore a dark red coat embroidered with gold thread and had chestnut-colored curly long hair. To this attendant of mysteries, there were quite a number of angels that he got to know in his long life. There were only a few that were stronger than a sequence one knowledge emperor. For example, the Antigonus ancestor before he became the half-full angel of fate Ouroboros, or the Red of Warbrass who could indirectly obtain the strength of the Red Angel of Fate. But under such circumstances, Zeratul believed that summoning Roselle Gustav's historical void projection first was safer. Before the Antigonus family's ancestor became the half-full, he, too, was a sequence one attendant of mysteries. Therefore, he would be suppressed by the enemy who had deeper control of Sapphira Castle and a level that surpassed most kings of angels. After all, his enemy was the closest to a true god. After Zeratul chose to cooperate with the Rose School of Thought and Adam, the success rate of summoning the Angel of Fate Ouroboros would undoubtedly drop. It wasn't suitable for him to attempt it at a critical moment. The Red of Warbrass that could borrow the Red Angel's powers didn't possess the strength directly, so the actual effects produced weren't any stronger than that of Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav. In comparison, Zeratul would definitely choose the historical projection that he was most familiar with and the easiest to successfully summon. His plan was to seize the opportunity that Gehrman Sparrow had directly wandered here without preparing any historical void projections in advance to use Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav, the Red of War Army Brass, and Abomination Sua to hold him back and leave him enough time to create a miracle for himself. As soon as Roselle's figure appeared, he immediately condensed into complicated and illusory symbols in his eyes in a bid to infuse large amounts of miscellaneous and useless knowledge into his target's mind, causing his brain to explode. At the same time, Zeratul used the various connections he had set up in advance to move himself. This swamp was his home ground. As he made slippery and transparent tentacles penetrate the hooded black robe and stretch into the fog of history, he summoned the Red of Warbrass. At that moment, Roselle Gustav's historical projection suddenly turned his head and used a subtle connection to look towards Zeratul's true form. Zeratul's mind was instantly filled with information and useless knowledge. His brain nearly exploded as he was unable to process his thoughts for a short period of time. He froze on the spot, his gaze not even changing. The historical projection, Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav, that he had summoned had betrayed him. Klein was both surprised and unsurprised by this outcome. It wasn't surprising because this was his own doing. The worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle had already grafted Roselle's present state to the concealed state that Klein had met. The surprising thing was that Adam had never reminded Zeratul to be careful of Roselle Gustav. Klein had previously sensed the coincidences in certain matters. His preparations included using the Fool symbol's connection to Roselle Gustav's seal. Through the corresponding prayer point of light, he could throw a worm of spirit that contained certain words or intent to his fellow earthling who was in deep sleep and awaken him. Then, using a miracle, he could temporarily suppress the corruptive powers of the mother goddess of depravity. Back then, the worst-case scenario that Klein took precautions against was if something happened to him that prevented him from contacting Sapphira Castle. As such, the worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle and the worms of spirit that were scattered in different places would end up losing control and be unable to save him. Once the worm of spirit he gave Roselle mutated, Roselle would know that there was something wrong. He could then use the powers of a Black Emperor to distort order to maintain the worm of spirit's lucidity for a certain period of time. As for what plan the worm of spirit and Roselle would come up with to save himself, Klein didn't know either. This was the real reason why he could hide from Adam. With his experience in the Hall of Truth, Klein knew that he wouldn't have any secrets when facing the visionary. Any rescue plans, be it figured out from the past or on the spot, would be seen and heard clearly by Adam. At his level, the only way to avoid it was if even he himself didn't know how to save himself. Of course, visionary Adam knew without a doubt that Klein had a worm of spirit in Roselle Gustav's Black Emperor mausoleum. He knew that his backup plan definitely came from this, but he wasn't able to pry into the secrets of it because it was contaminated by the mother goddess of depravity. It was a place that had been corrupted by the cosmos, and the thought of prying into Roselle Gustav was like prying into an outer deity. This was the difference in level. It was precisely because of this that Klein could calmly ask all kinds of secrets and read the second blasphemy slate. On the one hand, knowledge was indeed tempting. And on the other hand, he was stalling for time, waiting for the other side to complete the task of rescuing him. At the same time, he didn't want to occupy his mind, otherwise, he couldn't help but think about how he could save himself. As a result, Klein began to suspect that other than the unknown reasons as to why Adam had shared so many secrets with him, was because he was also trying to lure him into thinking of the solutions he would use to save himself, so as to find clues and stop him in advance. Therefore, the question-and-answer session in the Corpse Cathedral was a clash of minds. Klein had to constantly control himself to prevent his thoughts from going astray. And under this premise, Adam clearly knew that there might be problems with Roselle Gustav, but he didn't remind Zeratul. Regardless of the reason, Klein had no intention of letting the opportunity slip. He immediately raised the Staff of the Stars in his hand and skillfully simulated Amon's Worm of Time's powers. An ancient mottled stone clock phantom appeared. Its face was separated into 12 different segments by grayish-white and bluish-black colors. Each segment represented a different symbol of time. One of the 3 needles in the middle of the stone clock jumped, and Zeratul's body froze on the spot. Klein immediately transformed into a maggot vortex that extended countless slippery tentacles. In the middle of the vortex was a strange door of light. The door of light didn't move as the vortex swirled around it. A terrifying suction force forcefully pulled out the Beyonder characteristics within Zeratul's body. This was the method Palaz Zoroast had used to deal with Amon's avatar back then. He had relied on his position to forcibly gather characteristics. Bit by bit, the Beyonder characteristics flew out at an accelerating rate. By the time Zeratul escaped his frozen state and the mental explosion, he was already unable to extricate himself. He could only watch helplessly as he was completely carried into the dark and gloomy maggot whirlpool. A few seconds later, the vortex outlined its body again, and Klein landed his feet on the ground. In the fog of history, Zeratul's figure appeared again and again, but it was impossible for him to retrieve his Beyonder characteristics. In the end, it could only fade away silently, making it difficult for him to completely revive. Klein used the ritual's remnant effects that hadn't completely dissipated and directly swallowed Zeratul's characteristic. He wanted to use this to lower the influence of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. As the Corpse Cathedral was still floating in the sea of lightning, Adam, who wore a simple white robe and had a faint blonde beard, suddenly appeared at the edge of the waters near the ruins of the Battle of Gods. The sea split apart, and a path appeared. It led straight to the spot which was stained with the ancient sun god's blood. It led straight to the giant king's court's projection, the forsaken land of the gods. In the depths of the forsaken land of the gods, at the top of a mountain peak, there was a huge cross erected, and there was an indistinct figure hanging upside down on it. Chapter 1354. This night late at night, the clanging sound of the door and windows opening woke Wendell up from his deep sleep. He warily rolled off the bed and surveyed his surroundings. What happened? Utopia encountered a super heavy storm? It wasn't easy for the recently insomniac Wendell to fall asleep, but he had no choice but to get out of bed. His mind was still lethargic and he looked rather lost. He soon realized that there was no wind blowing in from the open window, nor did the rain enter. It was like he had opened it while sleepwalking to take in fresh air. Wendell suddenly thought of the supernatural events that he had experienced and learned from the dossier. He was reminded of the fear of the unknown that once ruled his heart. He didn't know what else would happen next, nor could he guess what he would encounter. He felt a chill run down his back as he shivered again. At this moment, he heard the commotion outside the door. All sorts of voices entered his ears. There were the loud sounds of running, the sounds of judgment, the declarations of orders to be changed, and unconcealed shouts. Something is wrong with the underground seal. Be on high alert. Underground seal? What kind of item is sealed beneath the Iris's hotel? Wendell was surprised and confused. He couldn't help but walk to the door and look around. He then saw an MI9 colleague, who he barely knew, and Colonel Zyodericha, who was on duty tonight. Did MI9 find Utopia because of me? They're here to handle the abnormality? Wendell instinctively frowned just as the thought flashed through his mind. He discovered that the corridor outside was completely different from the Iris's hotel. Not only were there gas lamps on both sides, but there were also classical candle stands. The floor was very bright, and the ceiling was more than 3 meters high. This isn't the Iris's hotel. Wendell suddenly turned around and sized up the room he was in. He quickly recognized that this was his sleeping quarters at MI9 headquarters. His luggage was placed quietly in a corner without any signs of movement. Wendell clearly remembered that he had headed to Utopia through the washroom in his room. He wasn't too confident in the process, so he didn't bring his luggage and only held the subpoena from Utopia's courts. Tut, tut, tut. He quickly ran to the window and looked outside. What greeted his eyes was the garden and lawn at MI9 headquarters. Back in Backland again? Or perhaps, I didn't return to Utopia at all. I was just too tired and ended up having a dream in my sleep? Wendell dazedly walked back to his bed and sat down. After about 10 seconds, he suddenly jumped up and picked up his coat from the ground. Then, he saw the Utopian subpoena in the inner pocket of the coat when it should be inside a drawer. Wendell fell silent, as though he had become a statue. Travel columnist, Monica, also woke up from the banging of the doors and windows. She sat up straight, pulled the blanket up, and placed it in front of her chest. The sleepy-eyed Monica's first reaction was that a robber had barged into the hotel. She was about to scream and call for the police. But in the next 10 to 20 seconds, Monica didn't hear any footsteps entering her room. However, there were more and more people gathered along the corridor. What happened? It doesn't seem like a hurricane. Was it a prank? Damn clown, if I knew who it was, I would definitely kick his ass hard. The voices of discussion were mixed with all kinds of curses. Monica didn't think much of it when she heard it. Instead, she thought of using the crowd's discussion to consider the reason underlying the paranormal activity and write it in her traveling column. But as she listened, she gradually realized something was amiss. How could Iris's hotel have so many guests? She remembered clearly that on this floor, there were at most 5 rooms with guests. This included her room. At that moment, Monica thought of the ghost stories she had heard. She immediately felt as if there were wraiths and shadows outside. She had originally stretched her feet towards the bedside, preparing to leave the room to participate in the discussion and grasp more details for her writing material. But now, she retracted her feet and curled into a ball, trembling. A few seconds later, she heard a man say, "I asked the hotel owner, and he said that he had no idea what happened. Perhaps there was a short storm just now. Return to your room and get some rest. Remember to lock the windows. Jan, I have to get up early tomorrow to go to the Royal Museum." Royal Museum? Monica was stunned. As a travel columnist, as a traveler who had been in Utopia for a long time, she naturally knew that there was no Royal Museum. In the Lone Kingdom, a museum with such a royal name would definitely be in Backlund. To take a steam locomotive from Utopia to Backlund required many hours. Even if he woke up early, he wouldn't be able to arrive before the Royal Museum closed. Monica was puzzled. She slowly lifted the blanket. She heard the sound of the door and windows closing continuously. She got off the bed carefully and walked towards the door. During this process, she gradually saw the room through the moonlight. Monica almost screamed. This wasn't the guest room she had slept in previously. Regardless of the layout or arrangement, they were completely different. The ghost stories that she had thought of earlier surged into her mind again, causing her legs to give way, and she almost couldn't support herself. Just as Monica's teeth were chattering, she saw a hotel name card on the table. It was prepared for guests. If she brought it out, she would be able to get someone to guide her back when she was lost, even if she didn't know the language. Monica subconsciously approached it and used the moonlight to identify the words on the name card. Karlpensa Hotel, Backlund West Borough, 19 Morning Street. Backlund West Borough. Monica's eyes widened as she felt like space and time had gone topsy-turvy. Backlund, Hillston Borough, in a house with a fireplace. Furs heard the door and windows open, but she didn't immediately wake up. This was because she had fallen into a strange nightmare and couldn't break free. She dreamed that her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, had been influenced by the family's sealed artifact, dying in front of her with blood dripping. She dreamed that she had lost control and mutated, turning into a series of starlight insects that warped into the shape of doors. She couldn't help but fly towards a door of flesh and blood. She dreamed that the apocalypse had dawned, and the surging blood-colored tide had drowned the entire world, preventing Zio, Gehrman Sparrow, and company from escaping. Finally, Furs escaped the dream and sat up, panting heavily. As a demigod, one who was once an astrologer, she knew what such a dream meant. She hurriedly suppressed her emotions and looked up ahead. The glass on the oriel window in the bedroom all bore open at some point in time. Something must have happened. Furthermore, it has a certain relationship with the apocalypse, the Abraham family, and the apprentice pathway. Furs silently muttered to herself before standing up and wearing a cloak, preparing to teleport to her teacher to confirm his safety. Such a change made her feel a sense of urgency towards advancing to Sequence 3 or even Sequence 2. After learning about the apocalypse from Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow, Furs had actually been working hard, but the secret sorcerer potion wasn't something that she could digest in a short period of time. Furthermore, without making any contributions, she couldn't bring herself to ask her teacher for the Wanderer's formula and ingredients. Of course, if she was willing, she could have obtained it from Mr. Dorr. However, how could she have been bewitched after receiving all kinds of reminders? Phasing away, Furs vanished from the room. A few seconds later, she appeared at Dorian Gray Abraham's residence and saw her teacher sitting there, pressing down on his heart as though he had been frightened. "Do you need medicine?" Furs asked carefully. She had purchased medicine from Mr. Moon to treat ailments of age. Dorian took a deep breath and shook his head. "There's no need." Furs immediately relaxed. "Teacher, I dreamed that you were affected by the negative effects of the sealed artifact. The windows and doors around me had undergone unnecessary changes, so I came over to take a look." Dorian looked up at the window open and said with a serious expression, "Your dream wasn't wrong. I nearly died just now, but at the most critical moment, the seal came into effect." Having said that, he suddenly stood up and said to Furs, "Quick, bring me somewhere else. I'm worried that something might happen to the other family members." Without any hesitation, Furs immediately grabbed her teacher's arm and asked for the exact location. Their figures rapidly faded away and disappeared. After traveling through the spirit world that was covered in gray fog for several seconds, Furs and Dorian suddenly left their present environment and landed in a place that looked like a study. There were quite a few people standing there. They were members of the Abraham family who wielded different sealed artifacts and could travel. Velos? Why are all of you here? Dorian blurted out. Velos and the others shook their heads at the same time, both confused and terrified. In the next second, countless dazzling stars appeared out of the void. The starlight quickly gathered together, turning into objects that fell to the ground one after another. There was a miniature door of starlight, a crystal ball formed from insects. There was a translucent, strange-looking key, a resplendent torch that burned slightly. For some reason, names after names appeared in Dorian and company's minds. Sequence 3 Wanderer Beyonder characteristic. Sequence 4 Secret Sorcerer Beyonder characteristic. Sequence 1 Key of Stars Beyonder characteristic. Sequence 2 Planeswalker Beyonder characteristic. Furthermore, there wasn't just one of each Beyonder characteristic. There were even 2 Sequence 1 Key of Stars Beyonder characteristics. In addition, there were 3 Planeswalker Beyonder characteristics, and even more of the rest. The key members of the Abraham family and Furs slowly turned agape, unable to close them for a long time. By the time all the Beyonder characteristics dropped to the ground, nothing abnormal happened again. There was silence. Chapter 1355. Wrapping up the matter, the nearly frozen silence lasted for nearly 10 seconds before the Abraham family members uniformly cast their gaze at Furs. After sensing the mixed emotions of wariness, guardedness, and fear, Furs took the initiative to take a few steps to the side and warned, "Be careful of the negative effects." Even if the Beyonder characteristics hadn't fused with the surroundings and formed sealed artifacts, they contained certain negative effects. However, most of the time, it would only have effects from direct contact. Of course, the Beyonder characteristics here were all high-sequence Beyonder characteristics. No one could be certain if they would actively expand their area of influence. Seeing that Furs didn't show any obvious greed, Dorian nodded and said, "When you finish digesting the secret sorcerer potion, you can consider advancing to Sequence 3 Wanderer. I'll give you the potion formula and prepare the corresponding ingredients for you. Of course, at this level, the higher the sequence, the greater the danger you face. This is an objective situation. It doesn't change because of your personal will and arrangements. When the time comes, you can decide whether you wish to advance or not." He said these words because he cared for his student, and on the other hand, he wanted to assure her that whatever the Abraham family possessed was equivalent to her possessing it. No one would treat her as an outsider and deliberately make things difficult for her on the matter of raising her sequence. This could effectively eliminate the heat brought by greed. And after obtaining so many high-sequence Beyonder characteristics, Velos and the other members of the Abraham family weren't unwilling to part with a Wanderer Beyonder characteristic. They even believed that using it to exchange for peace was absolutely worth it. After all, there was only one demigod here, Furs. Without the time to bring out their Grade 0 sealed artifacts, and because of the ineffectiveness of the seals, the Abraham family members didn't dare take out most of the Grade 1 sealed artifacts. Under such a situation, Furs had the ability to finish all of them off. Faced with her teacher's promise, Furs tersely acknowledged. Was the door to the concealed space opened? She thought that the high-sequence Beyonder characteristics in front of her were all from the Abraham family's treasure vault and had been thrown into the real world due to the recent abnormality. However, she did feel that there were too many of them. No. Dorian slowly shook his head, looking confused. The other Abraham family members remained silent, equally confused. No one would believe that treasure would fall from the skies unless it happened before their eyes. Should we pray to Mr. Fool? Furs tried giving a suggestion. Dorian, who had a vague guess, immediately looked at the other Abrahams. He saw the ones who had changed faiths to Mr. Fool nod in agreement. Those who hadn't changed faiths were clearly hesitant and eager to object. After some consideration, Dorian composed himself and said, "Gather the ones with negative area of effect traits while using the correct method. Prevent them from combining with the surroundings. I'll pray to Mr. Fool at the side. All right. The few members of the Abraham family hesitated for 2 seconds before agreeing. Following that, they seized the opportunity to identify the characteristics and attempt to gather them. After some of the members had obtained a certain amount, Dorian finally retreated to Furza's side and bowed his head to pray to Mr. Fool. Soon, a grayish-white fog and an ancient palace deep in the fog appeared in front of him. A high and solemn voice resounded in his ears. These are the relics of Mr. Dor. Your bloodline curse has been completely removed. Relics of Mr. Dor. Relics. Dorian ruminated over the word and opened his eyes, casting his gaze at the high sequence beyond her characteristics. He looked on silently, his vision gradually blurring. East Chester County, the Hall family manor. Alfred and the others, who had just figured out the source of the explosion and the enemy attack shout, saw the doors and windows opening at the same time as they crashed into the walls. During this process, several pieces of glass shattered. There is indeed something abnormal. Alfred raised his hand with a solemn expression. He said to his adjutant, squire, personal guards, and bodyguards, retreat back to the main house to prevent any accidents that might happen next. At the same time, send a telegram to the Archbishop of East Chester Diocese and request for assistance. He felt that the most important thing right now was not to investigate the anomaly, but to protect his father, mother, and sister. He had plenty of time to do the former after daybreak. But if anything happened to the latter, it would be impossible to make up for it. After returning to the manor's main house and arranging for strict patrols, Alfred walked into the living room and said to Earl Hall, there was indeed something abnormal, but the guard couldn't describe what he saw. He only felt extreme fear at that moment. Earl Hall nodded calmly and said, we'll do further investigations after daybreak. Sit down and get some rest. Beside him, Audrey was holding her mother's arm as she quietly listened to her father and 2 brothers talking. Of course, this was only an image. She had been continuously releasing virtual personas in an attempt to find the reason for the sudden opening of doors and windows from the memories of eyewitnesses. After a few minutes, she ended the investigation, somewhat disappointed. For the time being, she temporarily attributed it to the influence left behind by the Mind Dragon, Airihog, and Mr. Wrath. At that moment, she realized that the golden retriever, Susie, had a strange look in her eyes. She quickly sent out a virtual persona and entered the mind island of the other party's soul to have a private conversation. What did you discover? Audrey asked directly. On Susie's mind island, a voice resounded, I smell a thick scent of blood. At the edge of the manor, it happened sometime before the doors and windows opened. Yes, it happened about 10 seconds after the explosion. After hearing that, Audrey pursed her lips and fell silent for a few seconds. Go take a look. Susie immediately stood up and tiptoed out of the living room. She left the manor's main house from a side door on the first floor. During this process, there would be people looking at her from time to time, but they didn't mind her and didn't attempt to stop her. After all, she was just a dog who had mastered psychological invisibility. After walking the path to the furthest building from the manor's main house, Susie twitched her nose and chose an open window before jumping in. Then she saw a bloody corpse on the bed. Its skin had shed. And what she saw was equivalent to Audrey seeing it through the virtual persona that she planted in her mind island. In the living room inside the main house of the manor, Audrey, who was holding her mother's arm, lowered her head. Then she lifted her head, and her eyes swept slowly and deeply across her family's faces. Earl Hall, Lady Caitlin, Hibbert, and Alfred. She maintained her silence, becoming increasingly silent. I am inside the Cathedral of Waves. Alger, who was wearing a robe embroidered with the storm symbol, walked out from the underground area one step at a time. He nodded at the mandated punishers and priests who were waiting by the sides. The seals were restored to normal in time. You can return the items under your watch. Yes, Your Eminence. The mandated punishers, priests, and bishops heaved a sigh of relief as they struck their left chest with their right fists. Alger didn't say anything else as he responded with the same salute. After returning to his room, he slowly looked around. He took a deep breath and found a seat to sit down. The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Alger silently prayed to Mr. Fool, expressing his thoughts of preparing to leave the Church of Storms. The explanation that the seal was restored to normal in time could only convince relatively low-level members of the church. It was impossible to hide from any cardinal or high-ranking deacon, much less the pontiff and the Lord of Storms. And if he didn't get Mr. Fool's approval and protection, Alger didn't dare leave the Church of Storms so casually. He would definitely suffer the wrath of a god. A few seconds later, he saw the familiar boundless gray fog and heard Mr. Fool's reply, "Okay. Go to the Church of the Sea God." Phew. Alger relaxed, stood up, and took off his storm robe. After changing into a linen shirt, brown jacket, and pantaloons, Alger looked at the cardinal robe on the table and fell silent for a while. Then, he reached out and folded the robe neatly. After carefully examining it for a few seconds, Alger retracted his gaze and flew out of the cathedral through the open-board window by controlling a strong wind. He first flew to the bell tower and landed on the top. He looked down at the surrounding streets and down at Byam. During this process, Alger stepped on the edge of the roof and slowly circled it. Finally, he closed his eyes. A hurricane suddenly stirred as it swept Alger towards the Church of the Sea God. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein silently sat on the high-backed chair belonging to the Fool. His figure would occasionally turn incorporeal, as though he was wearing a mysterious and classical black robe. During such instances, he wore a hood that made his face indiscernible. At other times, he would return to normal. However, he was enveloped in a faint gray fog. The frequency of this change gradually slowed down. And every time Klein transformed into the black-robed, hooded figure, slippery tentacles with strange patterns growing would extend out from under his clothes. These nearly transparent tentacles flailed about, striking everywhere as if taking the palace for itself. After a while, Klein's figure finally stabilized. Out of habit, he raised his right hand and rubbed his temples as he muttered to himself, "The awakening of the celestial worthies will is faster and more intense than I expected. If I hadn't devoured Zeradal's Beyonder characteristic and used the remnant mental imprint to balance it and stalled for time, I wouldn't have been able to adjust my state and stop him from awakening." However, this made Klein's mental state rather unstable. And he didn't lose control because his miracle invoker potion had already been completely digested, and the new attendant of Mystery's Beyonder characteristic he consumed was mostly digested shortly after consumption. The identity of the world was a blessed of the owner of Sapphira Castle, making it directly equivalent to the attendant of Mysteries. Therefore, Klein had already acted the role of attendant of Mysteries for a very long time, and it had been quite successful. As for the second attendant of Mystery's Beyonder characteristic, he still needed some time to digest it. Chapter 1356 Urgency. After stabilizing his anchors, the will of the celestial worthy, and the weak balance of his consciousness, Klein leaned back in his chair and observed the various powers brought about by the attendant of Mystery's Beyonder characteristic. Among them, there were three most important ones. They were all grasped by Klein using Sapphira Castle and the Curtain ahead of time, but he just didn't know the exact names. The first was Regenerate. If the materials that made up an item once had a spirit body, then the attendant of Mysteries could use the powers of Regenerate to summon the corresponding spirit body threads, making the item become his marionette. Then, he could establish a deep connection with the item and also naturally transform it into a marionette. To put it simply, an attendant of Mysteries couldn't allow something that didn't have spirit body threads to produce spirit body threads, but he could allow some items to regenerate their spirit body threads that had long disappeared. The former represented metallic items, gold coins, gold pounds, and so on. The latter mainly consisted of beef, fish, and other food. Once humans ate food that were marionettes, they would also transform into marionettes, as though they had encountered intense corruption. The second was reassembly, which was also known as tampering. It could reassemble many physical objects or abstract concepts into something different, resulting in an unbelievable effect. It was like changing the definition, logic, orientation, or rules. The third was the realm of mysteries. This was an ability used to create an embryonic form of a divine kingdom. It could bring about a certain concealment effect. Reassembly represents the authority of change, while the realm of mysteries represents concealment. The two essential elements of the Fool's symbol are in place. However, reassembly and tampering doesn't sound nice, and the meaning isn't clear enough. Grafting is still better. It's obvious at a glance. Klein mumbled inwardly before casting his gaze around. Now, he had deepened his control of Sapphira Castle. He could directly borrow the powers nearing Sequence 0 of the Seer pathway. He could also use most of the Beyonder powers below Sequence 0 of the Marauder and Apprentice pathways. It was quite similar to Dark Angel Sasra from back then. Of course, Dark Angel Sasra could only use the first Blasphemy Slate to indirectly use the powers of the Chaos Sea. As for Klein, he was the owner of Sapphira Castle, one that hadn't fully gained control of the Sapphira. Therefore, his level was higher than Dark Angel Sasra's. As for strength, in theory he was stronger, but his strength was affected by too many factors. Having only become a Beyonder after a few years, Klein couldn't guarantee that he would definitely be able to defeat Heaven's Deputy and the Left Hand of God. In short, he was now considered a king of the King of Angels, and he was very close to the level of a true god. After gaining a deeper grasp of Sapphira Castle, the difference between me in here and in the outside world is almost gone. It wouldn't result in me being a king of angels outside, but having the power of a true god in Sapphira Castle. The greatest advantage here is it provides me a defensive barrier that even a true god can't break. Yes, whether the outer deities can do it remains to be seen. Klein slowly exhaled as he focused his attention on the current situation. There were two things he was most worried about at present. The first was the primordial moon, which was also the mother goddess of depravity. Although she failed to fully descend into the real world with Mr. Door's return, a little portion of her strength had invaded. Furthermore, she maintained it for a few seconds under the attacks of the 5 orthodox deities of Evernight, Steam, and company. Whether this would affect the surroundings, the corresponding pathways, and exert certain effects on some matters remained to be seen. Second, Angel of Time Amon has already stolen Mr. Door's ritual and became Sequence 0 of the Marauder pathway. He would be Klein's most direct and most powerful enemy. I wonder if Amon has taken the opportunity to accommodate Mr. Door's uniqueness and sequence one key of stars. If he has completed this step, he will be the most powerful true god in the real world. I wonder how he compares to the Evernight goddess. No one knows how much of the death and god of combat uniquenesses the goddess has accommodated. Typically speaking, Amon shouldn't have the time to accommodate the apprentice pathway's uniqueness. Although Mr. Door's return is equivalent to the ritual itself, the most important matter at that moment was to replace Mr. Door, allowing the 3 sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics and the uniqueness of the Marauder pathway to gather together, resulting in a qualitative change. There's no time to accommodate the uniqueness of the apprentice pathway. Also, this operation has a high chance of awakening the celestial worthy. Amon wouldn't take such a risk. In other words, Amon's subsequent focus is to accommodate the uniqueness of the apprentice pathway and become a true god of 2 pathways. Otherwise, under the watch of the other true deities, it will be very difficult for him to finish off a king of angels like me. Furthermore, even if he does take the risk and succeeds, him having accommodated the apprentice pathway's uniqueness means that he has to slowly adapt and stabilize his condition, making it impossible to deal with me in a short period of time. I have to make use of the time to become the fool. Only by doing so can I use Sapphira Castle and my own level to resist Amon. I don't have much time left. Klein silently gave a self-deprecating comment. He leaned forward and gently tapped the edge of the long modeled table. He was analyzing the possibility of him becoming the fool in a short period of time. The digestion of the Attendant of Mysteries potion was relatively simple. By the time Klein used his anchor and consciousness to suppress the awakening of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and not lose control or become someone else, he could use Sapphira Castle to create an avatar like Amon. Then, he could use the power of Sapphira Castle to steal the undigested attendant of mysteries beyonder characteristic he got from Zeratul. At this point, Klein would immediately turn the avatar into a marionette to prevent any unexpected developments. This way, Klein would drop to the level of an attendant of mysteries who had fully digested the potion, and he would have an attendant of mysteries marionette. This was one of the main ingredients of the potion. And the attendant of mysteries who had digested the potion was qualified to consume the fool's potion and become a sequence 0 true god. These series of operations weren't too complicated, but it was prone to mistakes. Furthermore, an ordinary dual sequence 1 king of angels from the seer pathway couldn't do it unless they have a sequence 2 Trojan horse of destiny friend of the marauder pathway who's willing to sacrifice himself to provide help. Of course, a sequence 1 worm of time friend could do it. Therefore, to Klein, the most troublesome thing was the other 2 matters. First, how to deal with the half-fool of the Antigonus family, and secondly, how to complete the ritual of fooling time, history, or fate. With my current level and strength, it isn't impossible to deal with the Antigonus family's ancestor. Of course, the prerequisite is that I should first familiarize myself with the corresponding beyonder powers and changes in Sapphira Castle. Sigh, I don't have any idea on how to approach the fool's ritual at all. Klein raised his hand and pinched his forehead, casting his gaze at the grayish-white fog beneath Sapphira Castle. Among time, history, and fate, he was undoubtedly more familiar with history. Now, he could use Sapphira Castle to directly influence the fog of history, allowing the corresponding powers of the seer pathway to become stronger or weaker. This was the embodiment of authority. Fooling history. Fooling history. Klein tapped the edge of the long-modeled table again as various thoughts flashed through his mind, but he repeatedly wrote them off. In his opinion, all the possible solutions didn't satisfy the requirements of fooling history. This was because history objectively recorded what had happened. Whatever happened was definitely reasonable, and the solutions that could satisfy the requirements, such as returning to the past, consuming the potion, and becoming the fool that came from history, wasn't able to achieve it. At the very least, Klein had never seen the ability to reverse time. As his gaze moved deep into the fog of history, Klein suddenly had a feasible idea. The present reality of history was this. The Tarot Club members believed that they were following the fool that didn't belong to this era, an awakened ancient god or an existence that surpassed an ancient god. In fact, Mr. Fool was originally just an ordinary person hanging above the gray fog. He used all sorts of resources to package himself and improve himself. Klein's thoughts were inspired by Amon. He could use Sapphira Castle to create an avatar, and let the avatar use Sapphira Castle to steal the fate, consciousness, anchors, and Zeratul sequence 1 attendant of mysteries beyonder characteristic. Therefore, the main body's beyonder characteristic was formed purely from the one inside the curtain, in which the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings was slowly awakening in. This way, the understanding of the Tarot Club members was correct. Mr. Fool was a great existence that was awakening. This went against the true history, but it was a fact grounded in reality. It could fulfill the requirements of the ritual. Of course, the premise was that the act of stealing an avatar needed to happen in Sapphira Castle or other concealed areas. Otherwise, it would also be recorded in history, preventing it from achieving the effects of fooling. As for how he was to deal with the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings when he awakened, and how his avatar was to kill his true form and make him a potion, Klein was temporarily out of a solution. The result of this attempt is equivalent to suicide. Before being killed by the celestial worthy, my avatar's attendant of mysteries beyonder characteristic would have been digested by then. After all, I successfully revived the Lord of the Mysteries. Klein shook his head and threw the incomplete plan to the back of his mind. Under the circumstances where he couldn't think of a solution, he decided to seek advice from the existences that might know what to do. He had 2 targets. One was Snake of Fate Willosepton, and the other was the Evernight Goddess. The former might have some thoughts about fooling fate, while the latter probably knew what kind of ritual the ancestor of the Antigonus family used to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. After stabilizing his mental state, Klein left Sapphira Castle and directly teleported to Backlund. Chapter 1357. Meeting deep in the forsaken land of the gods, on the peak of a mountain stood a gigantic cross that bordered the realm of reality and illusion. There was a blurry figure hanging there. Ancient wooden stakes dyed with fresh blood that didn't drip down passed through his body, nailing him to the cross. At the bottom of the cross was the angel of fate Ouroboros, who was wearing a simple linen robe and had silver hair that reached his waist. He sat there cross-legged with a gentle and pious expression as he closed his eyes and prayed. Adam, whose face was half covered by a pale blonde beard, walked over and stopped in front of the huge cross. He raised his head and silently looked at the hanging figure. He held a rose in one hand and held the second blasphemy slate in the other. His eyes were limpid and his expression was calm. After an unknown period of time, the image of the hanged man on the huge cross suddenly faded away, connecting to the sky and to the land below with a shadow curtain. Behind the curtain, there seemed to be a pair of cold eyes watching over the world. In the next second, a rift appeared in the shadow curtain. It was dark inside, faintly reverberating with an illusory tidal wave. Adam raised his left hand and let the ancient and mysterious magic mirror emit a faint glow. In the light, a sticky but illusory black liquid surged out. A boundless sea that seemed to contain all colors appeared. It looked like it was at arm's length but couldn't affect reality. Following that, Adam placed the second blasphemy slate into the illusory scene. The illusory sea seen in the distance ebbed gently as it circled the second blasphemy slate, forming a certain connection with it. The second blasphemy slate was a manifestation of the corpse of the ancient sun god, one which was extremely close to being a great old one, and almost equivalent to the owner of the Chaos Sea. Upon seeing this scene, Adam's left hand moved slightly, allowing a rose to fly up and fall towards the angel of fate Ouroboros under the huge cross. The second blasphemy slate that he held underwent some subtle changes, and through the rift on the curtain he walked inside. The shadow curtain closed and quickly faded away, leaving behind a huge empty cross. No one said a word throughout the entire process. Everything was carried out silently. Angel of fate Ouroboros didn't even attempt to open his eyes. At the same time, Amon became a god and used the first blasphemy slate to block the tunnel that the mother goddess of depravity was trying to enter through. The Lord of Storms finally smote apart the corpse cathedral that Adam had envisioned out of nothing, and one of Adam's identities. After a while, Tail Devourer Ouroboros opened his eyes and cast his gaze at a rose, which had landed on his lap. On the surface of the mirror, silver words appeared in the swirling illusory water. You should know the feeling of piously believing and following a great existence, right? Ouroboros nodded indifferently. So, can you send me back to my lord? On the surface of the mirror, silver words squirmed and formed a new sentence. Once you answer, you can ask me 2 questions. Ouroboros silently looked at the ancient mirror in silence for a long time. Finally, Rhodes couldn't help but produce a new question. Why aren't you answering? Ouroboros looked at himself in the mirror and replied calmly, I haven't thought through it yet. 3 questions. On the surface of the magic mirror, the silver light slowly outlined 2 words. In Backlund, on a lawn that belonged to a bungalow. Willosepton, who was already over 2 years old, was happily chasing a fat golden cat with glistening fur. Beside him was a nanny and a maid. Ever since this snake of fate was born, Aaron Sirius's career had improved by the day. Now, he owned a private hospital that provided medical services to high society. As he ran, Willosepton stepped on a spot that was slippery. With a slip, his body involuntarily leaned back. He took a few steps back and stepped on another rock. This provided an impetus to stop Willosepton's fall, miraculously allowing him to maintain his balance. In regards to this encounter, alarms started ringing in this chubby toddler's head. This was because with his luck, it was impossible for him to step on a spot that could make people slip. A familiar figure quickly appeared in his eyes. It was Sherlock Moriarty wearing a half-top hat and a black double-breasted coat. Will Septon turned his head abruptly and looked at his nanny and maid. He discovered that they hadn't noticed the appearance of the stranger on the lawn. "I have a nagging feeling you would say, 'Go ahead and scream. No one will hear you,'" the 2-year-old toddler mumbled as he turned around. Without waiting for Klein's reply, he spread his hands and said, "In short, I must congratulate you on becoming a king of angels. Bullying children doesn't suit your current status." Klein let out a soft chuckle. "Do you know how to fool fate?" Will Septon raised his head and looked warily at Klein. "Giving me fake ice cream isn't equivalent to fooling fate." With that said, he grumbled, "Why don't you squat down? At my age, it'll be bad for my next development if I have to keep raising my head like this." Klein didn't have the air of a newly advanced king of angels. He squatted down with a smile, allowing Will Septon to look him straight in the eye. Will Septon held his nanny's hand and said, "Unless I've advanced to sequence 0 and become a wheel of fortune, fooling me in any form doesn't count as fooling fate." Klein thought and asked, "You haven't found the opportunity to accommodate the die of probability?" "No." Will Septon shook his head before adding, "I have a premonition that it's coming soon." Klein carefully looked at the chubby 2-year-old toddler for a few seconds before suddenly smiling. "If I were to give you and the die of probability to Ouroboros, would he quickly advance to sequence 0? Will Septon glared at Klein and said, "He will also need to wait for an opportunity to accommodate it. Furthermore, the opportunity to become a wheel of fortune and the requirement to accommodate the die of probability isn't the same." He spoke. Will Septon curled his lips. "If you wish to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, the corresponding ritual can be simplified. It won't be that difficult. In such a situation, by ingeniously using the abilities of a Trojan horse of destiny and making a sacrifice to a certain degree, there's a chance of fooling fate. However, when you attempt to advance to sequence 0, even if you accommodate the uniqueness and absorb 3 sequence 1 beyonder characteristics on separate occasions, you will still have to hold a ritual, allowing the corresponding items to fuse and undergo a qualitative change. Does that so? In other words, choosing to first accommodate the uniqueness is just a trick, but in the end, I have to truly fool time, history, or fate." Klein nodded slightly and said, "I roughly understand." He smiled and added, "Enjoy your childhood. I wonder how long it will last." With that said, Klein's figure turned transparent and vanished from the lawn. Will Septon's other empty hand instinctively grabbed forward before retracting it weakly. "He left just like that? He's so rude. He actually didn't prepare a present when he visited," the child couldn't help but mutter. Northborough in Backland. St. Samuel Cathedral. Klein, who had transformed into Dwayne Dantes, walked into the prayer hall and found a corner to sit down. He looked at the Evernight's sacred emblem on the altar, lowered his head, clasped his hands, and began to pray. The Evernight goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the mother of concealment, the empress of misfortune and horror. As he prayed, Klein's body and mind gradually settled down as though he had entered a half-awake state. After an unknown period of time, a boundless darkness appeared in front of him. Beside his feet was a clump of night vanilla and slumber flowers. This place was so quiet that even breathing seemed to disturb those in slumber around him. Before Klein could survey his surroundings, a figure suddenly descended from the depths of the darkness. There was clearly no sky or land here, but the figure seemed to come from the crimson moon or the stars in the sky. She was wearing a long, layered black dress that didn't seem complicated at all. It was adorned with countless resplendent lights, as though the starry night sky had been draped upon it. Her head was indistinct and difficult to discern. He could only confirm that it was a female. "Long time no see," the figure said gently before Klein spoke. Her voice was like a lullaby. Klein bowed in a gentlemanly manner and said, "Is this directed at the former Lord of the Mysteries, or me who was previously hung above Sapphira Castle?" Klein was very certain that this was a dream, but a dream didn't mean that it was fake. The Evernight goddess's projection said with a smile, "I'm not sure where you were hanging above that door of light. After I left, I never went back again." Indeed, Klein sighed inwardly. From the details, he confirmed the origins of the Evernight goddess Ammonises. "The 3 cocoons of light that tore open were side by side," he replied simply. The Evernight goddess's projection was silently floating in the darkness, giving off a surreal feeling. She said softly, "The people there were all candidates meant for the Lord of the Mysteries' revival, but due to some unknown incident, he lost control of many things. If it wasn't for that, I would have died long ago and lived with the identity of the Lord of the Mysteries. Then, you and Roselle wouldn't have had the chance to return to reality. This means that the death of the celestial worthy is more thorough. He can only rely on the will left inside the Beyonder characteristic and the mechanical arrangements of Sapphira Castle to revive." Klein sighed and smiled. "I can already hear him whispering into my ears." Chapter 1358 Conversation. The Evernight goddess's projection calmly said, "For him or them, we are unable to defeat or stop them. All we can do is resist and suppress them. Perhaps, at certain times, a tiny oversight or relaxing even the slightest will turn us into him. On the path of being a Beyonder, danger is always accompanying us. No one knows when one will fall into the abyss." Klein silently added a few words for the Evernight goddess. He thought for a moment and asked, "Did you cause some sort of disturbance when I was born?" Seemingly fused with the surroundings, the Evernight goddess nodded slightly. "I used the uniqueness in Antigonus to indirectly affect Sapphira Castle to temper the Beyonder characteristic that accompanied your birth to the forsaken land of the gods." Indeed, Klein sighed and frowned. "The uniqueness of Antigonus can indirectly influence Sapphira Castle?" The Evernight goddess's projection replied gently like a lullaby, "He has already lost control. This also means that his self-awareness is no longer able to suppress the Lord of the Mysteries' will in him. The two psyches are stitched together, revealing the most primitive, most instinctual, and also most bloody and crazy side. And the Lord of the Mysteries is the former owner of Sapphira Castle. The present Antigonus can indirectly influence Sapphira Castle by using this identity very naturally. It's no wonder the Evernight goddess has a greater understanding of the strange door of light than Emperor Roselle. On the one hand, she was born from Sapphira Castle, and on the other hand, she had imprisoned the crazy Antigonus." Klein was enlightened as he continued asking, "Why didn't you have any Beyonder characteristics accompanying you and Roselle when both of you were born? In that case, be it the Evernight goddess or Emperor Roselle, they definitely would have chosen one of the seer, apprentice, or marauder pathways." The Evernight goddess's projection said indifferently, "This is also why I said that something unknown had happened to the Lord of the Mysteries, causing many of the prior arrangements to be out of control. After 2 consecutive failures, Sapphira Castle experienced a certain change. This is also a good thing for you. As the apocalypse arrives, the remnant will of the Lord of the Mysteries has dissipated. In the end, all that's left is a mental imprint that's attempting to awaken. If you were born in the 4th epoch, you would have become him the moment you became an attendant of mysteries." This was because Klein had used the curtain left behind by the celestial worthy during his advancement. As for the Beyonder characteristics in the bodies of Antigonus and Zaradol, they had undergone generations of Beyonders and Beyonder creatures, diluting and wearing off the will. Klein had a nagging feeling that the Evernight goddess had some guesses about what had happened to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. However, since she deliberately didn't mention it, it wasn't appropriate for him to probe further. All he could do was say, "How did Antigonus manage to accommodate the fool's uniqueness?" The Evernight goddess's dream projection didn't hide anything as, she replied gently, sought the help of Adam and Ammon. They were supporting a Lista tutor back then. Using the abilities of the Trojan horse of destiny, Klein acutely grasped the core reason based on Will Ossepton's explanation and his inference. The Evernight goddess's projection that was like the starry sky of the night quietly comforted her surroundings. They captured a demigod from the Solomon Empire and got Adam to do a deeper-level hypnotism act and a transplant of the corresponding memory, making him believe that he was Antigonus. Then, with Amon working with Antigonus, he stole Antigonus's identity and fate while Antigonus used the tampering authority to combine the identity and fate with the experimental subject. That demigod from the Solomon Empire began living in the state of Antigonus, and after some time, he took the initiative to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He undoubtedly lost control. At this moment, the real Antigonus removed the tampering, allowing his identity and fate to return into Amon's hands. Amon ended the theft and returned them to the original owner. Klein listened attentively and added thoughtfully, "If that's the case, it's equivalent to Antigonus failing to accommodate the uniqueness and turning into a monster, and a perfectly well Antigonus with no problems at all." The two completely different fates existed in the real world at the same time. Therefore, fate has been fooled to a certain extent. Before he finished his sentence, Klein sensed some latent problems and hurriedly asked, "Aren't there problems with this?" "It's very risky," the Evernight goddess's dream projection calmly replied. "Fate isn't easy to bear. If one can't retrieve the fate from the target in that short period of time while he's losing control, things will undoubtedly fail. Retrieving it a second earlier will not achieve the effect of the ritual. Retrieving it a second later will lead to Antigonus shouldering the fate of losing control and inevitably end up with the same outcome. That's right. One has to naturally bear the burden of the troubles brought about by fate. If not for that, Amon would have long stolen my fate and swaggered into Sapphira Castle." Klein mumbled inwardly as he began to think about how he should imitate the ritual of the Antigonus family's ancestor. It was difficult to complete a normal ritual, and with the urgency of the matter, using a simplified ritual to accommodate the full uniqueness was the best option. "Once I become the half-fool, my control over Sapphira Castle will improve. My level and strength will at least reach the level of a true god. This way, even if I face a dual-pathway true god like Amon, I'll be able to protect myself and wait for reinforcements even if I'm not a match for him." As Klein thought about the strength matchup and development he hoped for, he began coming up with a preliminary ritual plan. He planned on using the Evernight goddess's help to suppress the Antigonus family's ancestor and use Sapphira Castle to steal his identity, fate, and self-awareness. This way, his body would have his own consciousness, the will of the celestial worthy Antigonus ancestor's self-awareness, as well as the anchors from the New City of Silver, New Moon City, and Rorstad Archipelago. He would also become Antigonus to a certain extent and accept his fate of losing control and going mad. The reason why Antigonus went crazy was that his self-awareness could no longer suppress the awakening celestial worthy. The two psyches were stitched together. When his self-awareness reached Klein's body, he would undoubtedly repeat the same process. This was because the celestial worthy's will in Klein's body was no less than the one in his actual body. In other words, the fate of losing control and madness was unavoidable. Klein believed that there wouldn't be any additional burden when bearing it. At the same time, with him having more anchors than Antigonus, his own consciousness could remain center stage and in a harmonious state, maintaining a sliver of rationality. In such a state, he would use the identity of the Antigonus family's ancestor to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. And in the corresponding fate, this was something that he had long accommodated, so it wouldn't bring about any further repercussions. Hence, fate had been fooled. After the ritual ended, Klein would remove his theft and restore his original identity and fate, and no longer be affected by the madness, allowing him to become the half-fool. The main problem of this plan was in two places. First, it was to maintain his own state. Any slight accident could easily cause Klein to go crazy and be powerless to save himself. Second, no one knew for sure how much the celestial worthy's will in the body of the Antigonus family's ancestor would awaken or bring about unsuppressed changes. He could only rely on the Evernight goddess to balance it out. At this moment, the Evernight goddess's projections seemed to have guessed his thoughts. If you wish to steal the fate of Antigonus, it's best to let him enter a temporary state of eternal slumber. I can try to help you, but I need a medium to have the necessary confidence. This is an angel that had accommodated the fool's uniqueness. What medium? Klein asked, seemingly in thought. The Evernight goddess's projection said with a smile, the river water of the river of eternal darkness. As expected, to Klein, this answer wasn't surprising at all. It was even within his expectations. This made him feel rooted to the ground. He deliberated for a moment and said, just the river water? The Evernight goddess's projection nodded slightly and said, you won't be able to take away the entire river of eternal darkness at the moment. You'll understand once you reach the depths of Calderon City. You can ask the questions when you're back. Without waiting for Klein to answer, she added, for you, there's an unusual danger there. You better wait until your mental state is stable before you go. All right. Although Klein didn't know what he would encounter in the depths of Calderon City, he knew that he wasn't in the right state to take risks, especially when it involved a Sapphira. The Evernight goddess's projection continued, when you wake up, hold a bestowment ritual. I will give you an item that can be used to scoop up the river water of the river of eternal darkness. Klein nodded and said without a word, Adam is part of the ancient sun god, one of his identities. The Evernight goddess's projection didn't show any obvious signs of emotion. She gently said, he has already gone to the forsaken land of the gods and met the true creator. That's fast. After feeling a little surprised, Klein felt that it was only right. The reason why Adam allowed the secret to be exposed was that the secret was no longer of value. The Evernight goddess's projection continued, no matter what happens next, it will take a long period of time. You don't have to pay attention to it for now. After Klein nodded, the figure in front of him quickly turned blurry. The night vanilla and slumber flowers under his feet flew up one after another, scattering throughout the darkness. He opened his eyes and saw the dark hall and the pure light shining through the holes in the wall. The latter were like stars embedded into a velvet night sky. Chapter 1359. Early morning. Klein watched as scarlet flames suddenly appeared and engulfed him. When the sparks scattered, his figure had already vanished from St. Samuel Cathedral. In an ordinary inn's empty room, Klein walked out of the sudden rising flames and began setting up a bestowment ritual. Soon, the mysterious door formed by candlelight opened. An ancient accessory flew out from the endless darkness and landed on the altar. This accessory seemed to be made out of gold. It looked like a slender bird, surrounded by a pair of wings formed by white flames. The bronze eyes shimmered with layers of light as though there were illusory doors hidden within. Klein sincerely thanked the Evernight goddess, ended the ritual, and picked up the golden bird-shaped accessory. This seems to be the image of the legendary phoenix ancestor Greggrace. Beyond this ancient death's own pathway, she had apparently grasped partial authority of the apprentice pathway. This is a preliminary conclusion from the city ruins in the forsaken land of the gods that believed in the phoenix. It's no wonder most ancient gods find it difficult to control their emotions. They were on the edge of madness. No, they were constantly teetering between madness and rationality. Before the first blasphemy slate appeared, none of the Beyonder creatures had the concept of a sequence pathway. They only had the concept of convergence, reproduction, and blind attempts. As Klein carefully examined the golden bird-shaped accessory, he sighed inwardly. As the owner of Sapphira Castle, he could sense that there was a subtle connection between the accessory and the river of eternal darkness. So it can contain the river water of the river of eternal darkness? Yes, the river water of the river of eternal darkness is definitely not river water in the true sense of the phrase, but an abstract concept or symbol. Klein nodded in thought and threw the golden bird-shaped accessory into Sapphira Castle, sealing it in the junk pile to prevent any unnecessary accidents. On a mountain peak outside Byam City, the Red Angel evil spirit watched as the edge of the sea gradually lit up as an orange sun slowly left the horizon. At some point in time, a young man wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe appeared beside him. The man played with a crystal monocle and wore it on his right eye. It was Aman, who had become Mr. Error. Saran Einhorn Medici turned his head and glanced at Aman. The sacrifice you provided was actually the original body. If it wasn't my true body, how could I have the time to steal the ritual and replace Bethel? Aman replied with a smile. As a qualified conspirer, you shouldn't have not thought of this. The Red Angel evil spirit scoffed. How would I know that you weren't trying to trick me? Perhaps you'd predicted my prediction? Aman smiled and didn't answer directly. Instead, he took out a strange crown covered in rust and blood. This is your reward. He threw the item to Sauron Einhorn Medici. After the Red Angel evil spirit caught the strange crown, he was somewhat surprised. Wow, you actually didn't try to go back on your word. Doing something that doesn't match your expectations is also a form of deception. Aman pinched the monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, I'm looking forward to you becoming the Red Priest and devouring that demoness. When that happens, your image will definitely be extremely interesting. As Aman said this, his smile carried an unconcealable sense of warped humor. Sauron Einhorn Medici fell silent for a moment before saying, I don't think it will be very different from how I am now. Two bloody mouths opened on both sides of his face before quickly closing. Aman adjusted the monocle on his right eye and looked to the other side of the sea. The situation in the Western continent seems interesting. With that said, the present Mr. Error, the former Angel of Time, turned into light and dissipated. The Red Angel evil spirit looked in the direction of where Aman was looking at and tossed the strange crown in his hand. On both sides of his face, the bloody mouths appeared once again as they said, after absorbing this beyonder characteristic, you'd better stay away from Bansi. If you wish to grow breasts and have your body swell up, you can continue staying there. Medici curled his lips and said, Isn't this something you both wish for? Facing the altar filled with materials and artifacts, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The table in front of him instantly became empty and clean. All the junk had been split up in categories and returned to their original location. This was a miracle that stemmed from one of Klein's accumulated wishes. Compared to the past miracle invokers and attendants of mysteries, the miracles I can create can be described as quite varied. It's very practical, including but not limited to building houses, interior design, garbage classification, and environment protection. Klein looked at the cleared and laughed self-deprecatingly. He then opened the door and left. He wanted to return to the real world and return to human society to strengthen his humanity and stabilize his mental state. His problem now was relatively problematic. If he directly sought Miss Justice's treatment before first suppressing the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, he would only contaminate her and allow his psychiatrist to suffer mental illnesses. Of course, if Miss Justice had reached Sequence 2, the effects wouldn't be too great. The current Backlund had been rebuilt, and the number of pedestrians coming and going had returned to their previous peak. Just as Klein pushed open the inn's door, he heard all sorts of voices. Wait. Fresh fish from Pritz Harbor. It has plenty of meat and little bones. It's great for frying. Special ginger beer matched with muffins and potato wedges. Hot and fresh oyster soup. The freshest vegetables. Most of the noise came from the street vendors, and some came from a small number of passengers who were chasing the public carriage or pedestrians who were knocked down by people in a rush. The early morning rush painted such a noisy, sonorous, and chaotic scene. Klein listened to these unfamiliar yet familiar shouts and silently looked at the scene in front of him. He didn't move for a few minutes. Only when a thief came close did he put his hands into the black coat's pockets and walk towards the nearest coffee shop. A cup of good coffee, a set of mutton stewed with peas, and a piece of oatmeal bread, Klein said to the affordable coffee shop's owner. A total of 11 pence, the boss said after a mental calculation. Then he added, the price of everything is rising now. Klein didn't say anything. He took out a 1 solely note from the junk pile in Sapphira Castle and handed it to the boss. He then found a seat by the window which wasn't very greasy. He took out a few pieces of tissue to line the table. Following that, Klein placed a piece of letter paper on top of it and took out a dark red fountain pen. After watching the morning scenery and pedestrians, he finally wrote, "Dear Mr. Azik, I haven't written to you for another month, because I had no choice but to sleep for some time. This isn't because I'm hurt, but because the ritual requires it. When I woke up and walked into human society again, on the streets, it suddenly reminded me of the life I had when I was in Tianjin. At that time, it was always very noisy in the morning. A large number of citizens would leave their homes, rushing to the factories or companies. The mobile peddlers gathered on the street and peddled their vegetables, food, and fruits of questionable quality. They were always cheap. I would always protect my wallet and carefully squeeze through them before heading to the station and wait for the public carriage with many people. I worked at the Blackthorn Security Company at 36 Zutland Street and had a group of good colleagues. Dunn Smith was the captain, the supervisor there. He was an experienced, kind, and responsible beyonder. He had a mild personality and was experienced in his job. He also cared for all the members in the team, and his only flaw was his bad memory. For matters which weren't too important, he might forget about it the moment he turned around. He often said, "Hold on, there's still another thing." Of course, there was a reason why. He had lost too many companions. He hoped that they would all stay in his dreams, so he often became lost as to which matter was reality and which belonged to dreams. Old Neil was my first mysticism teacher. The most useful skill he taught me was expense claims. He always designed strange ritualistic magic, hoping to obtain help from the goddess. Some of it succeeded, while others produced ridiculous accidents. Until today, I can still recall them. He was a very kind person. Even when he was seeking to fulfill his everlasting dream, he didn't wish to harm others. Leonard is a poet with his own secrets. At first, I thought he was very mysterious and a hidden expert that needed attention to be placed on. Later, I realized that he was a crude, simple, impulsive, rebellious, aloof, and rude young man. Furthermore, he really doesn't have any literary talent, so he could only rely on memorizing things to complete the acting requirement. Yes, he barely has some merits. He's considered rather brave, and he has sharp intuition and terrifying reasoning abilities in certain matters. However, this is limited to certain matters. Fry was a cold-looking beyonder who no one dared to approach. But in fact, he has a sense of responsibility and a warm heart. He would always extend his hand when others needed help. Kenley was very short. He used to be a civilian staff member, and he then took the initiative to apply to become an official member. He was quite smart, but he would never decline a case. Every time he played cards, he would talk about his fiancée. Rose Ann is the receptionist at the Blackthorn Security Company. She's lively and lazy, and she's loved by everyone. To us, she's like a younger sister. She also likes every single one of us, but she also hates all the official members because her father was once an official beyonder who later died in the course of duty. Perhaps, in her heart, official members were equivalent to people who received a notice that they were infected with a critical illness. Mrs. Oriana is an accountant, a victim of a supernatural case. She's delicate and gentle, and she pursues an exquisite life. She usually doesn't speak much, but she takes good care of everyone and doesn't make things difficult for us regarding finances. For example, she rarely rejects old Neil's expense claims, no matter how ridiculous the reason was. She would only leave it to the captain to make a decision. Mam Sika Tron has rare natural white hair, and she's an unsuccessful author. She has an outstanding temperament and a quiet personality. She doesn't seem like a beyonder who fights at night. She's also very brave and very firm. Even when facing death, she doesn't flinch. Mam Royale is very similar to Fry. They don't talk much but are very concerned about their colleagues. Yes, except at the card table. Brett is the best at writing reports among the clerks. He's a romantic gentleman. Even though he's been married for 15 years, he still loves his wife very much. I think he'll live a good life because he lives by the maxim that the less he knows, the longer he'll live. Cesare Francis is our carriage driver. Despite being a civilian staff member, he often encounters dangerous situations. Therefore, The captain handed over the matters regarding the purchase of goods and applications to him. He doesn't make his presence known, and perhaps this is the key to his survival. I occasionally think about it. If it weren't for the things that happened later, I would definitely still be living in Tianjin. I would work on time every day. I'll be on duty to man the basement, and I would deal with the few cases that crop up while playing cards with my colleagues. I would occasionally accompany Melissa and Benson to watch a play or a circus show. If I can come home early one day, I'll study cooking. That's a huge hobby of mine. When the weekend comes, I might come to visit you and talk about the history of various fields. It's a pity that life is always pushing us forward and making us face changes. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.